Okay, okay. Yes, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Gnome on board Africa. I would like to call it season two. Don't mind me. I like to play around things. You're welcome, and it's 2:32, and then we are starting right about now. So, like we promised, last time was great. I really enjoyed myself with the flavor of speakers that actually gave that gave a whole lot of things, a whole lot of knowledge to us for us to understand what open source is all about, and then how we can actually contribute to it. And I will be doing the same thing today with our speakers. And then yes, so before we move on, um I would like to actually set some things. Please, if you have a question, kindly drop the question in the chat section, or you drop the question on the we'll drop a link. We just dropped a link on the chat section now, the public chat. Kindly drop your questions on that link too. So you either use it, and then if you either use that. So, and then uh if you have a question, probably we are giving time for people to ask question audibly. Kindly make a note before you unmute your mic, and then we'll let you know if you have to unmute your mic or not. So we're going straight to what we have today. We have a lot of things, a lot of talks today, and then I would like to list them very fast. The first one would be create your future in tech, which will be handled by Justin Flory, and the second one is why join and how to get started. That is why join open source. Why join open source? I mean, why should I join open source, and how do I get started in open source? The third one is how GNOME supports multiple programming language. So majority of us are not the low level language guys. Majority of us don't write Python. When majority of those don't write C++, we don't write Jtk, and then like the only people that I know that does uh GNOME, or that contributes to GNOME, are those guys that write C++ and all that. How can I don't even write Python. Majority of African developers majorly write JavaScript. I know very well Nigerians, JavaScript. For mobile guys, you write Java, or you write Swift, or you write Kotlin, or you write that. So how can I contribute with those programming languages that I know? And that will be explained by Federico Mena Quintoro. And then the next is starting with open source while in university. This is for our university people. So, and then we'll go to how to use an inclusive language in our open source. So right about now, we'll be starting with Justin Flory, who we actually take us through the who will take us through the first session, which is open source 101. Create your future in tech. And I would like to invite Justin to actually take over, and then take us through what he wants us to do. This open source will create your future in tech. So Justin, welcome.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay before I get started? Just do a quick audio check.
Yeah, Justin, I can hear you. Welcome.
Perfect. So thanks everyone for joining. Happy to be here with the Gnome Onboard Africa event. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit on the basics of really what is this open source stuff all about, and how can you leverage this to actually build and create your own future in tech. And as a note, you can also find all these slides online. There's a link in the bottom, and you'll get that one more time before we wrap up today. So, open source, what is it? Open source it's a method. It is a way of working on software collaboratively together with other people, and it's a method to develop and distribute software. It can be a set of best practices to make software and build teams that make software. It's also a movement. Open source is a movement based on a set of ideals and philosophy that go beyond just code. And it's rooted in the belief that software has an impact that's greater than any one of us, and that there's certain freedoms that should be protected. And lastly, open source is a culture. It's a collection of people, values, and ideas that take the form of software projects and communities. So, okay, what are we going to be talking about today? So, as a disclaimer, normally this is a 60-minute presentation. I'm cutting it down to 20 minutes, so I won't get to cover everything in as much detail as I would like, but we'll try to make the best of it. So, talk a little bit about open source history, open source beyond code, how to get involved in open source, and if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about the Fedora project. So, who am I? My name is Justin Flory. I work at the UNICEF Office of Innovation as an open source technical advisor, where I support different international startup teams on building open source communities for their products. In addition to that, I've also been involved in open source communities and projects for 7 to 8 years. So I've been doing open source for about a third of my life, and I'm really happy to be sharing some of this experience and knowledge with you here today. So, okay, like I know I gave you those three words, but you know, what is open source really? Maybe you've heard of the acronym FOSS before, FOSS, for free and open source software. And this means free as in speech, not just free as in pizza or free as in beer. So source code is publicly available for reading and studying, use, and modification. But FOSS is also more than just the software. It's also a set of development practices, licensing, communities that help build the software. And usually they share a set of common values. So where is open source in the world? Hopefully you recognize at least a few of the logos on this screen. Usually when I give this in person, I'll ask, like, raise your hands if you recognize at least half. Raise your hand if you recognize all of them. Obviously can't do that today. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that open source is everywhere. It's in your pocket, it's in this room, and it's powering the entire internet. Just to underscore that point, where is open source on the web? In a study in 2014, it found that about roughly 80% of all public servers on the internet ran the open source Linux operating system or another similar type of operating system. And this was a while ago. This was before Microsoft had gone all in on Linux. So it have changed even today, but I would be really interested to know. There's also other examples of other web technology that's open source and used all over the internet, like the Apache web server, Node.js frameworks, the Flask framework with Python, Ruby on Rails. There's also open source, like I said, in this room. Maybe some of you are using Linux or Gnome to join in software. The Firefox and Chromium browsers, the open source base for Chrome, is also open source. And the LibreOffice community and open source, basically Microsoft Office, is another example that maybe you've seen or heard of. Open source is also in your code. Most programming languages, popular programming languages, are open source. So you might recognize the logos for things like Python and .NET and Swift, Rust, Go. These are just all some examples of different open source programming languages. And I think it's really interesting to emphasize that you'll notice there's a pretty wide range of companies represented here. Apple is Swift, Go is Google, .NET is Microsoft, Python is a nonprofit software foundation, Rust is or was Mozilla. There's all these big players who are doing this. It's not like these are like tiny companies or tiny organizations, but these are huge projects that a lot of people build their code and software with. And it's all open source. The programming languages are open source. So we talk a lot about public code and like having it visible, but why does that really matter? Why do we care about having public code? I think it comes down to these four things: control, training, security, stability. So with control, you have that freedom to examine the code, to study it, and have it your way. You can make changes that you need for your particular use case. It can also be helpful with training, whether you're trying to learn from other people. It's almost kind of like getting study guides, in a way, to software. You can get feedback and you can share mistakes. From a security point of view, you get more eyes on the code. It's usually quicker to solve problems on open source than it is with closed source. And lastly, stability is a huge piece. Working and building open standards makes it easier to be interoperable and switch between different tools or platforms by using an open standard. And one thing I always like to mention here is there's this sort of well-known truth, I guess, in the open source world called Linus's law, named after the Linus Torvalds, the creator of the Linux project. But given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow, which is just a way of saying that, with enough people looking at your code, it's not going to take that much time to figure out a bug versus just a small team of maybe 3 or 5 developers working on a project. So, okay, how did open source begin? Let's have a little bit of a story. I try not to go too deep on history, but I think a little bit is helpful just to understand how we go. So let's start, at the very beginning. We really have 1983. Richard Stallman starts the GNU Project. There's a lot that I could say here, but I'm going to try to keep it really short. Richard Stallman was an MIT researcher in the 80s who noticed a way that the way that we worked with software changed in universities and in companies in the 80s. It started to change. We used to, sharing software was to do these things. Nobody cared about licenses. Nobody really cared about reusing software because at the time, it was all about hardware. And there were all these different kinds of hardware makers, people making different kinds of chips that weren't compatible with other types. So nobody really cared as much about software until the 80s, once hardware. And suddenly people wanted to have licenses and for software, as making it more of a commodity. So Stallman saw all of this and he was like, I think this is not the way forward. He created the GNU Project, which was an open source operating system. And he had a set of values that he believed, and as well as the other team members believed, that were really important to the project, of making sure that software was always protecting the user and respecting their rights. So he tried to build an operating system and he called it the GNU Project. 1985, 2 years later, you have the Free Software Foundation, founded by Richard Stallman and a couple of other folks. What's important, actually a nonprofit organization in the United States. It starts to formalize, give some structure and support to the GNU project that Stallman created. 4 years later, you have the first copyleft open source license called the GNU Public License. At the time, it was a really radical idea of licensing, because if anyone makes changes to a project licensed under the GPL, they have to license their changes under the same license, which basically just means that if you're going to make changes to a GPL project, they have to be open source. You can't tell people how they can use it or how they have to use it, and you can't prevent people from making changes. So this was the first time, this was a license that was used in the GNU project, and this was the first time we actually have a legal document backing this whole open source stuff. So we skip ahead really quick to 1991. Maybe some of you know about the Linux kernel, but the important piece here is that the Linux kernel becomes it's a new open source project, and it is one of the first adopters of the GPL license. Skip ahead 6 more years to 1997. There's this book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar that's written at this time. It's the first time that open source starts to go mainstream. Like people in the rest of the software and tech world really start talking about this for the first time. Because up till now, it was kind of this niche, like it was kind of this weird thing people did. Nobody really understood it, but it was starting to catch ground. It was really starting to take off around the late 90s because, you know, Linux had been doing it now and it was working pretty well for Linux. They were still going on. So I think the Cathedral and the Bazaar, it's just a good reference in terms of when this started to go mainstream, like when people started to really, more people started to care about open source. And you follow that up finally in 1998, opensource.org, the open source initiative was founded to help better connect the values of the free software world with the practicality that comes with working on open source. Like those 4 benefits I mentioned earlier, control and security. They really tried to help build that, how you talk about these things in a way that doesn't scare people away when you say it's free. So, you know, I gave you all this history and maybe it's interesting, maybe it's not, but maybe you're asking like, you know, why does this all matter? This was all in the 20th century and it's 2020. This is a year of all kinds of different things. So what I think is still important even today is what we call the 4 freedoms of open source. You know, behind every the basic promise of open source is in these four things that you always you have the freedom to do with open source code. And if you don't do any one of these things, whatever you're doing, it's not open source. It's proprietary, even if you publish it publicly. So the 4 freedoms of open source is the freedom to read. You can read, study, understand what other people have done. You can get that source code. You can use the software any way you want. No one's telling you how you have to use it or what you can't do with it. That's up to you to decide. You can also revise it, make changes, make remixes, and share those with other people. Nothing's stopping you from making changes to fit your needs, and also redistribute. You can share your to make changes and share them with more people. So when we talk about open source, this is what open source means. And you know, I think there's a really great story here because in 2001, Microsoft was looking at all this open source stuff, and they were this wasn't Bill Gates and it wasn't Steve Ballmer, but it was like the 3rd or 4th top Microsoft exec who said this. And you know, open source is an intellectual property destroyer. Oh, I can't imagine anything that would be worse. You know, and there's even some other quotes of people at Microsoft around this time calling the Linux project a cancer. People in Microsoft felt very passionate about open source in 2001. But, you know, 15 years later, how are things looking? How are things changing? And this is from a blog post, a press release. Microsoft officially in love with open source. Oh, Microsoft has been working with open source for 10 years. We love Linux. We have 140 working groups with open standards. We have over 400 projects where open source code is written first. And that was in 2016 before Microsoft dropped, I don't know, a few $1 billion on GitHub. And now they own GitHub. Like Microsoft, like this is from 2016. And even now, this is already a little dated. I mean, if you look at what Microsoft has really done to go all in on open source. So I mentioned this as I think it's interesting because it just gives you this perspective about how people look at open source and how that's changed, even in the last 20 years. So I have a section about open source beyond software, but because of time, I'm not going to have a chance to cover this. This is a really important topic because open source is more than just code, but I'll have to cover it another time. I'm sorry. So we'll talk about contributing to open source a little bit here. That'll probably be the last topic before we wrap up. If we have time to talk about Fedora, I'd like to do that too. But I always like to stop here and just talk about, you know, open source sounds cool and it's interesting and maybe you want to get involved, but how do you actually like do this and make the right decisions for picking a project to get involved with? Like maybe you're doing this in your free time, maybe you're getting paid for it, but there's always a set of questions you should ask yourself before you get involved in a new community. So I'm going to share my 2 tips on getting started with open source and things you should keep in mind as you're looking for a project or a community. These are great things to keep in mind. So first, you need to find something that you actually care about. This needs to be something that interests you and you actually think is really interesting or cool, because that's what's going to, when things get hard, because they always get hard, there's always a challenge. If it's something that you actually care about and really interests you, that's just going to make it easier for you to actually succeed, because you're going to be motivated. You're going to be excited about it. You're going to want to do the work, even if it's hard. So don't try to choose a project alone just on people who are there or trying to get your name out. Like, those are all important things around networking, but it'll come in time. I don't think it's the most helpful place to start with how you think about these things. An example, if you're not sure about where to start, like you don't have an open source project that shouts its name in your head, I usually just find looking at your computer or your phone, things that you're already using. You might notice there's these little acknowledgements pages sometimes in apps where they give, like, we used all this open source software to make our app. That can be an interesting place to look if you're really lost. There's also great folks here in the Gnome community who, if you're using Linux on the desktop, there's lots of opportunities to, actually shape and influence the operating system you're running on your system. So moral to the story is pick something you actually care about, because that's going to be so important when it gets hard. The second thing that's also equally important is, once you find that project that is interesting, you think, try to align your own with your interests in the project. So, take a look, like, okay, you found like maybe 5 projects you think are interesting, and maybe, just a little bit about Python, or you've written a few documentations, or you have a little bit of design experience. It's not just code. This slide really emphasizes code, but there's, like I said, it's, open source needs designers and community people and marketing people and writers just as much as the programmers. So, whether it's code or not, that's one easy place to start, because maybe that's what comes to people's mind first when they think about tech and code projects. But try to align, once you find that project you think is really cool, figure out where you can contribute and how you might be able to figure out what opportunities are there in the community for you to get involved. So those were the 2 tips. And once you do those 2 things, I always think there's this last step on evaluate, to really understand, hey, it's a cool project and the software, the code is cool, and you think you can do something, but you don't want to get involved with a community of jerks. You're going to be working on an open source project with other real live human beings, which maybe doesn't sound so challenging, but when you add in the remote context and all this other stuff, especially these days in COVID-19 times, it's really important. So always consider the community before you get involved and jump into a project. You want to choose a community that is going to be friendly and empowers you to contribute, even if you're a newcomer. So one way to try to do some looking around is look at mailing lists or forums or public chat rooms. Like, figure out where the community is talking and just, watch, see how things are. How do people treat each other? Are people nice to each other? Is it a welcoming community? These are all things that are important too, beyond just code, because again, especially if you're volunteering on this, you're putting your own free time in this. You want to make sure you're getting something, a positive experience out of it. And, one great thing to always look out for is if there's any onboarding materials that the project makes specifically available, like how to get started. So this will be, I think, the last thing. I won't have time to talk about Fedora today, unfortunately, but there'll be another time, I'm sure. So the last thing I want to talk about is really, what does really bring to you in your career and trying to build your own tech career or get involved in this industry. So the first part, the easy one, is like take what you're already learning. You know, if you're trying to learn new things, maybe you're going to university or maybe you haven't, but you can get real experience and build your skills, and then you can actually point to it and be like, hey, you know, I did this thing and it's out here on GitHub, and anyone who wants to see it and look at your work can find it. Networking is also a big piece. Is just you meet really cool people. You know, I've met amazing people from all around the tech world who I have learned so much for and have helped me so much in my own career. And I always try to contribute that back too. And you just meet all these really cool people, and that can open up new opportunities yourself. There's also leadership opportunities. You might have chances to lead on a project or a specific task that's important to you. And I originally gave this slide to students. I don't know if everyone here is going to be a student, but your perspective matters, and especially maybe just knowing that the world historically has been Western white. That we're getting more people's voices and perspectives in open source. So your voice matters, and you should be there. And lastly, just the friendships, and this is also a dated slide, travel opportunities. Remember when that was a thing. But friendships, I think, is still really important. Like I've met cool people who matter to me professionally, but I've also just met really cool people who I think of as my friends, and people who are from different backgrounds or have different, you know, I consider them my friends. I thought I was going to get out of open source from the beginning. So I know we have just 2 minutes here. It's not a lot of time, and I'm skipping over a lot. But just want to emphasize again, open source it's a method, it's a move. You know, and I hope I tried to tell that story. I was really sad I couldn't do the full detail on this, but I hope it was at least interesting and helpful to get that overview, that kind of high-level background overview of open source. Slides are available below. I have exactly 1 minute. I'll look at the Etherpad really quick to see if there's any questions. Let me open that up really quick.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Justine. Thank you very much. Yeah, so there are questions on the Etherpad, and one, I think I think it's enough for you to really answer. You work at UNICEF, and then but let me ask, the person ask, how do we assess Gnome projects to contribute? That's the first question. How do we assess Gnome projects? So I think the question to you is, how do we assess projects to contribute, especially projects on GitLab and GitHub. Majority of us are used to GitHub and not GitLab and all that. So how do we assess that?
So for Gnome specifically, I think you'll probably get great information from the other sessions that are coming up today. Generally about looking for open source, one thing that I always like to mention is, where is this? It's a website that collects starter tasks and like good first issues for people to work on in open source. I know I have that up for grabs. That's the link. I'll put this link into the Etherpad and also the big blue button chat, so it's there. Oops, I need the link, not the name. But I think that's a good place to look for, if you're trying to find that stuff, where can you look for it and find it? I think that's one of a few different places that can be helpful to start looking.
Okay, thank you very much, Justin. Yeah, thank you very much, Justin. That helps. And the last question that I think is for you is, how do we reach you? Are you open for mentorship? That is, are you open to mentor people? How do we reach you? That's the question person asked.
Yeah, so I'm always happy if you want to reach out to me and get in touch. I'll put my email here in the chat for reference. I wish I had more time and time that I could really devote to mentorship right now. But that's also what I do in my job is I help mentor these startup teams from around the world. So I don't know if I can promise mentorship right now, but if you do have questions or things you just want to get answered quickly, always happy to take your questions via email, and I'll try to get back to you when I can.
Oh,
So
okay.
that's all we have
Thank
time
you
for.
very.
Thanks for bringing me
All
out,
right.
and I'm happy to have been a part of the event.
All right. Thank you, Justin. We are so glad to have you. We are very happy, and then we'll be moving on to the next person on the line, which is Nurisi Sanchez. I don't know if I can pronounce the name very well. Okay, so we'll be having Nurisi Sanchez to take on or take us on open source engagement. Open source engagement. Why join and how to get started. Hello, Sanchez.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Sanchez.
Okay, great. And yeah, you did a great job of pronouncing my name. It's Nuritsi Sanchez. And I'm here.
I think.
Yeah, great job. So I am here to talk about open source engagement. And before I start, I just want to introduce myself to those who don't already know me. I am a senior open source program manager at GitLab. I am formerly the president and chairperson of the board of directors at the Gnome Foundation. And my academic background is in international relations and psychology. And I mentioned that and also had this kind of goofy photo because I am not necessarily the typical contributor to open source. I caught some of Justin's speech right before mine. And as he said, usually when people think of open source software, they think about developers. And that is not my background, and that is not what I do. But I still bring a lot of value to open source, I think, because I'm able to use other skill sets. And so that's what I'd like to talk about today and encourage you all to start participating within engagement. Today, what we're going to talk about is first define what is open source engagement, then why join an engagement team. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my own story, and then I want to tell you how we get started. All right, so first things first, what is open source engagement? I think that it has three different components to it: an internal, external, and a personal one. Internal, it's all about how do you make the community function better? Do contributors feel like they can fully participate? Are there workflows that are clear and transparent and people can easily join? Do people feel like they enjoy belonging to the community? These are things that are extremely important for making sure that an open source project succeeds. And an example of this at Gnome is that sometimes people would, get together and start working on things. They'd have hackathons or sprints, and they'd come up with great ideas, but then people from the outside complained that it wasn't transparent enough, that they didn't know when to add their ideas or when important decisions were being made. And so having the right workflows and transparency levels is really important. And so that's one type of engagement in my mind, is like making sure that the project itself is set up to successfully integrate different ideas and participants. Then there's an external part of engagement, which is all about promotion. It's about getting the word out there about open source projects, letting people know what it is. I know that I started a meetup group in San Francisco a while back, and a lot of women were interested because I mentioned that it was great for professional development. But when I tried to explain what Gnome actually was without them having used it, I kind of struggled. And partly that was because our website at the time and actually arguably still needs some work. And so it's not necessarily the most intuitive thing where people like say, yes, that's exactly, I want to contribute to GNOME. And so there's an external part of engagement of letting people know what it is and how to participate. Then there's a personal part of this, which is all about how you are engaged with the project. And I think that that feeds into both the internal and the external engagement, because it's all about, are you building new relationships within the project? Are you finding meaning in the work that you're doing? Are you growing in the areas that you want to grow? And are you taking care of yourself and not burning out? And I think that is super important. And something to really consider as you're thinking about the engagement and the whole community, just the community as a whole. So those, again, kind of inform the internal and the external parts of engagement. And when we think about engagement, here are some associated words and some skills. You might think about brand, marketing, and public relations. I think that's one of the most obvious ones. But it's also about process improvement and strategic thinking and community building, project management, program management, communication, writing, content, website and app development. Like, all of these things are incredibly important for engagement work. And someone might say, well, what about website and app development? Like, isn't that more of a developer thing then? But I would argue that you have to, like, thinking about how the GNOME website needs to evolve is something that is part of what the engagement team does. And we need website developers and app developers to help to make that a better experience. And so it's still part of the engagement work that we do. So for all of this, you know, the engagement team is a great place to develop almost any kind of skill. And it helps you then get to know the community so that then you can transition more easily into other groups. So it's a great entry point for those people that want to start contributing. So now we've talked about what it is. I want to talk about why you might consider joining. This is a lot of text, I apologize. But what I wanted to say is that it really does help the project. And engagement is critical to the success, and I would argue more so today than ever before. Because when open source projects first started, it was all about getting developers together and actually working on the technology to get it started. But now, as things are evolving, you need to make sure that there's a new wave of incomers, that projects are raising the amount of funding that they need to have hackathons and to keep doing sprints. And all of that requires engagement to promote and to really help facilitate all of those things. So I took this from a tweet, actually, that Ivana Isadora had posted on Twitter. There's a link to it at the bottom. But it's really about spreading awareness, about influencing participation, bringing positivity. So many people get, you know, criticized about the technology that they're building. And so even tweeting thanks or just, you know, bringing positivity into a project really is super appreciated. And growing a community. So those are ways that engagement actively helps the open source project and why it's vital to its growth. Another reason you might want to join is for your own professional development. Again, I heard Justin mention that at the end of his speech. And I really do think it's a great place to practice and learn new skills. You can expand your network among professionals and experts in the field. And you really have open source communities rely on people that can jump in and start participating without too much help sometimes. So it's also a great way to practice your leadership skills and to, you know, practice being more self-proficient. I wanted to also mention that sometimes open source projects have scholarships for people. I actually saw a few people from the Gnome Africa community already tweet about GitLab scholarships. And I think that sometimes that's where there's a lot of potential to keep sharing those opportunities, that's what engagement does. You create the opportunities by maybe saying, hey, we should have scholarships for interns to come learn about this technology, and then you share them. And that's so powerful, both for the project and for the community that you're a part of. There's also really fun aspects of contributing to engagement. A lot of us like to speak places or volunteer at events. And with that comes travel opportunities. This is a picture from Barcelona, Spain, which is where we held the Linux App Summit last year, and where Regina actually first got started participating in Gnome stuff. And this is a great place to just meet people in person, form relationships, and help out the project by facilitating workshops and just BOFs, hackathons, and also just thought leadership within the larger open source community. And another reason you might join, as Justin said, is friends all over the world. And here I have pictures again of the Linux App Summit in Spain. I met some friends from Indonesia, actually in India, at Gwadek in Sweden. And I visited Siska, who has the hijab in Indonesia. And she took me to have amazing food that I would not have tried if I were not friends with her and had gone to visit. And in Bogota in Colombia, I literally had never really been there. I hadn't considered going, and I made some great friends that showed me all around the area, some really cool salt caves. And it was all because of open source, of that involvement, of my going to speak places or volunteer to help with events. So it's pretty darn awesome. And I'd like to just tell you a little bit more about my own story in case you identify with any of it or it helps any of you. I first got involved in open source in 2012. So compared to a lot of people in open source, I'm pretty new because a lot of people have been involved since they were in diapers. I don't know, really long time ago, or when they were really young. And the reason I got involved is that I helped start a company called Endless that created Linux computers. And we decided to base it off of Gnome software. And so that's how I started to meet more of the community. Actually, I see somebody here that says that they could see Shri in some of the photos, and that's because he's part of my story in a really large way. I met him first at a hackathon in San Francisco, and he encouraged me to become part of the engagement team. And then a little bit later, my manager, who was also part of the GNOME community, ended up encouraging me to speak at Gwadek in 2015. There at Gwadek, I was a little nervous because I didn't know really a lot of people in the GNOME community. I wasn't a developer, and I'd never been to an open source software conference. So I just didn't know what to expect. And I was really encouraged that people were eager to hear what I had to say. I talked about designing an experience for people in Latin America primarily, and how you had to change different icons for cultural relevance and all of this. And people were really excited about it. They welcomed me with open arms. And I decided to participate in an engagement BOF, which is a birds of a feather session, basically like a hackathon type event. And I soon became a core contributor because I saw a lot of potential for continuing to grow that team and to build community within the GNOME project. Because of my work on the engagement team, I ended up being elected as the president and chairperson of GNOME for 3 consecutive terms. And there, I just got exposed to more of the open source ecosystem. I became really excited about collaborating with other projects, like the KDE community, for example. And all of that ultimately led to my job at GitLab. I'm the senior open source program manager there, and I'm helping to build an ecosystem for the open source community within GitLab. Right now, everybody thinks of GitHub as the place where open source lives. And at GitLab, we are an open source project. And so it makes sense for us to keep building that so that it's the place where open source communities really thrive. So again, all of this has kind of led to where I am in my professional career. But, you know, there are so many other ways that it's contributed to my life. As I mentioned, friendships and everything else. So this is just, you know, part of my story. And just again, for more context, what I'm up to now, because I'm actually not as involved in the Gnome project at this time, I took some time to focus on my new job at GitLab. And I think that that's really important when we talk about open source sustainability and about burnout, because burnout is real. I found myself so passionate that I was working on weekends and in all of my free time, and it just was not sustainable. And so focusing now on strategic ways that I can help not only at Gnome, but also within the larger open source ecosystem. I mentioned my work at GitLab, where I'm really thinking about open source community needs and how to build that ecosystem on GitLab. And then outside of that, I'm volunteering at other projects like Chaos Project with Shri and some other people from Gnome and KDE to build metrics, because I think that that's something that at least our projects have not been super great at. So if you're a data scientist or interested in data, please talk to me and get involved with Chaos. I'm also involved in FOSS responders, which was really helping people through the pandemic. And I am continuing to speak at conferences like this one about my areas of expertise, like communication, cross-functional team collaboration, etc. Okay, so hopefully with all of that, you get a sense of why you might want to join. You've seen an example of where it's worked, where I entered in engagement and got really thrown into the open source world, and now I'm really passionate about it. So how do you get started? You know, I've talked about my own story, but how might you get started? And I created this little sheet where I think it's important to bring some focus to how and why you want to get started in this in the first place. So question number one, you don't have to write this down, but you can think about it in your head. Think about at least one skill that you already have. Then think about one new skill that you want to learn in the next year. And finally, think about one thing that you're passionate about or highly interested in. I'll give you couple more seconds to think about that. If you'd like to write it down, feel free. If not, just think about it. Okay, so I thought I'd share my answers and show you how it kind of wraps in. So, excuse me, for me, I wrote down at least one skill. I wrote down a few, but I am skilled in project management, program management, product management, communication, and strategic thinking. For a skill that I'd like to develop is continue to develop my strategic thinking and my people management skills, and to continue to improve my communication skills. And then something that I'm passionate about is global social impact, poverty alleviation, mental health and well-being, collaborative communication. And so when you put all of those together, for me, the areas that I want to contribute to within engagement are, I like to organize things. I like to set this, like work on the strategy of the projects that we're going to work on. Then I like to help organize it and work with lots of different people to actually execute it. And so usually the types of projects that I'm most interested in have to do with community well-being. That kind of goes along with my mental health and well-being thing. And collaborative communication. I care about like workflows and how people are communicating. And I really like the global part. So I like to participate in conferences, events in Spanish, at conferences all over the world. So by having this list of things, it's helped me be able to focus my energy and to be able to understand the types of things that I'd like to do. And this kind of rolls into this concept called the luck surface area. I don't know if you all have heard of it. I've included a source with a link to the article down below. But what it is that you can increase your luck, essentially, by to the degree that you do something passionately, combined with how many people you talk to about it. So if you can say, I'm really passionate about communication, collaborative communication in a global setting, then people are going to start thinking about Ritzy as that. Usually it helps to think about like 3 things that you can pinpoint to. So like, let's say open source, global, and communication. And so then I tell as many people as I can about this, and then opportunities just start flooding in, because whenever someone thinks about open source, global, and communication, they think, Ritzy, I should tell her about this, or like, maybe I should have her speak here, or maybe I should introduce her to that person. And so your luck starts to increase because you're getting more opportunities. So I'd encourage you to read the article, and it kind of, again, rolls back into that focus worksheet that I posted, because it helps you identify and then communicate that to others within an open source project, so that then they can also help you explore those areas. All right, and then this other one is just connecting with others, how you get started, connecting with others. This is the most important part. It's about building relationships with other contributors. Here you see Shri again, and we have Gnome tattoos on. I don't know if you can see those. They were, temporary tattoos, don't worry. But yeah, these are the things that really help you navigate an open source project. It's making a relationship or building a relationship with somebody so that they can help give you advice when somebody criticizes something that you do, who can encourage you, or can tell you to encourage you in general to apply to be a board of director, or to start an initiative that you're excited about. So that personal connection is super important. And if you see that an open source project doesn't already have a way to connect with others, that might be a great thing to start contributing to. Help them build a way for people to form connections within the community. Help to create those opportunities, not only for yourself, but for everybody else in the community. And again, lots of text, but I just want to make sure that everyone comes away from this presentation understanding that engagement is one of the lowest barriers of entry into a project. And again, I took this from Ivana Isadora. If you haven't already followed her on Twitter, make sure to do so. But she talks about how even just retweeting something on Twitter, or promoting something on your social media, it's as easy as a click of a button, and it already helps to amplify a project's reach. Example number 1, you don't have to read the whole thing, but basically it's about genuine, simple efforts, and how things like having meetups in your community, or having events like this really help to engage other people around the world who may not have known what GNOME was, what open source was, what the project that you really care about is. Example number 2 is that, sure, you can create videos, animations, share memes, whatever you'd like. But again, simple is just retweeting things that people in the community are already doing, sharing blog posts, maybe writing some yourself. She also includes things like, if there's a new release, share the news about the new release. If the project is having an Ask Me Anything AMA session, boost that announcement or participate. And there's also about if there's online conferences, do live tweeting, or in general, amplify the reach of that conference. All of those things really help an organization. What I do is I take a lot of photos and I post about them because we have a lot of fun in our events. And I want to show the world that that's the type of community that we are. And by posting those images, it's almost like a self-reinforcing, I forget the terminology. I should know this because I studied psychology, but it's basically a self-fulfilling prophecy. You see these images of an inclusive, awesome community, and it becomes that even more so. I remember the term, yay. And then when you discover new features that you might have discovered just randomly on your own, share that in a blog post, in a tweet, on other social media, anything. It really helps. And don't worry if you think that it's old news, because not everybody is familiar with the project, so it's probably new to somebody. All right. This is basically it. I just wanted to encourage you all to begin today. You can live tweet about this session and the ones coming up. We have great content. And I just want to say this, or end with this Chinese proverb that probably all of you have heard a million times, but a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So take the initiative to just start promoting the projects that you love, connect with the people here at this event, and you're on your way to start becoming an engagement team member. So I sadly have to go after this session. So I am including some links to my social media. And if you have any questions, let's see, I think I have like 1 more minute to answer questions. But if not, send me a message and I'd be happy to connect with you afterwards.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Sanchez. Hey, Sanchez, thank you very much. Thank you. We appreciate you. And I really enjoyed that section. I don't know if anybody else does. And then we have a question here for you. I think two questions. One is how do we get into engagement? Is code and design only needed in open source? I think those are two questions written together. So how do we get into engagement? That's the first question. And the second one is code and design only needed for an open source, which I think you've answered. And then we have another one that says, is KDE and Gnome, are they partners? KDE and Gnomes, are they partners?
Sure. Okay, so the first one was about how you can join the engagement team at, I think, at Gnome. And so for that, we have a GitLab board where you can start participating. We also have a forum, and actually Shri, it has an onboarding initiative to make it even easier for people to join. But I would encourage people to join, let's see, Rocket Chat, and then the GitLab board. I can send some of this information afterwards, but I think that Shri's the person to talk to about this. Sorry, Shri, for adding more to your plate. But he's here and he'll be here for a while longer. So connect with him. And then the other question, yes, so I answered about design and development, that there are many other ways to participate in engagement. And then the last question was about KDE and Gnome. And we are forming a closer relationship with KDE. I think that there's we're all part of the same Linux desktop ecosystem and part of the broader open source family. And so I think that it's important for us to work with others that have similar goals as us. So we are collaborating more with them all the time. And with that, I sadly have to go. So it's been a pleasure. And thanks for having me.
Sanchez. All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for coming around. Yeah, that was a nice section, and then we enjoy it. Thank you, Sanchez, for coming around. And then while Sanchez was talking, I spotted Sri in the building. So welcome, Sri, although you're not coming next. we are going to the next item. That is how GNOME supports multiple programming language. So this is going to be a bit of a long session, and then it's going to be handled by Federico Mena Quintero. Oh my God! I hope somebody would not, you know, sue me for that. But I think I just pronounced it well. Well, Federico is one of the founders. He's one of the founders of GNOME. In the early days, he was responsible for some of the original code and documentations for the code GNOME libraries, games, and all. So I would like to welcome Federico. Federico to give us his own presentation. Hi, Federico. Okay, while Federico is coming up, please, if you have any question that we've not answered, we'll answer your question in due time. Okay, so let's wait a bit for Federico to come up. Hi, Federico. Okay, okay. Well, while we are having Federico to come up, I think we have to go to the next item, which is starting with open source while in university. This will be taken by Saloni Gag and Amit Sagtani. Am I correct? Saloni Gag, hi. Okay, I just learned that both there too. All right, we will move to the next item, which has to do with someone that I respect so much, and is no other person than Sri Ramakrishna. It will take us on how to use an inclusive language in an open source community. Hi, Sri.
I think Federico is here already. I think he's trying to type.
Okay. Okay, okay, we'll wait for you, Federico. Okay. Hi, Federico.
Hello, can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you and I can see your name.
All right, perfect.
Okay.
Please give me a minute to upload my slides. Just one
All right,
second.
that's fine.
Thanks. All right, so it's up now. Can people see that, the presentation?
Yes, we can see it. Yes, we can see your presentation.
Okay, so I guess I'll begin. I apologize for the slight delay. I'm just out of the shower, so sorry. It's in the morning here. So thanks everyone for attending. My name is Federico Mena, and I am going to tell you how Gnome manages to support multiple programming languages. We are very proud to be a project that provides a programming platform that actually makes an effort to support multiple programming languages by default. It's not an afterthought. So let's look into that. But since we're going to be talking about programming languages, I'm going to start with a joke. Why are assembly language programmers always wet? Because they all work below sea level.
That's funny, actually. Yeah, they all work with it. Oh my God, Nigerians will say, "Don't leave me, don't leave me."
Yeah, and maybe also because of the memory leaks, you know. Anyway.
Don't leave me, truly. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's begin. The people who already have programmed things for GNOME using GTK may be somewhat familiar with this. This is a small example in Python of how to write a very, very minimal hello world application that just shows a window. Right? So let's look at this a bit. This line here is magic from GI repository import GTK. That's where all the magic happens, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this session. The first two lines here make a window. Where's my pencil? Here's the pencil. Okay, so the first two lines create the window, set the title bar to say hello world. The next two lines, they create a text label that says I'm written in Python. It adds the label to the window, and the next line shows the window and the label, and the next line starts the main loop, so the program begins running. But the magic is all here. And it is pretty much the same thing, pretty much exactly the same code if you do the same in JavaScript. You import GTK with this magic line imports.gi.gtk. The JavaScript language bindings require initializing GTK, create the window, set the title, create the label, add the label to the window, show the window, and run the program. No problems so far, but all the magic, again, it's here. And even if you write it in even if you write the same thing in a static language like Rust, it's pretty much the same. You import your GTK library, you initialize it, create the window, set the title, create the label, add the label, show the window, run the program. And here the magic happens in another place because Rust is a static language. But let's look into how the hell does GNOME allow for multiple programming languages to work. Again, the magic goes there. The basic thing to note here is that the platform libraries, including GTK, the graphical toolkit, they're written in C. They are not written in Python or JavaScript or Rust, which are the languages you actually want to use to write applications. If you look at the C code in GTK, there's a function called GTK window new. It takes an enumeration value called GTK window type, which tells it if you want a top-level window or a pop-up window or a dialog, and it returns a window. And it has a method called setTitle, but since C does not support object-oriented programming by default, we fake it. So this window, GTK window setTitle, takes a window and a title string, and it does whatever it needs to do to set the title on the window and repaint it. But all of this is written in C, so how do we make it visible to other programming languages? The thing about GTK is that it uses some special techniques in C to fake object-oriented programming in a language that doesn't support it. So, for example, there's a method for the GTK widget class. If you were writing this in Python, it would look like this. You have a GTK widget class with a method called showAll. It just takes the self parameter, but in C it looks like that. It looks like a function named called GTK widget showAll with a single parameter, which is widget, which is the same as self in Python. And what we do in C is we do some magic here to extract the class structure where the methods live. They are function pointers. So if the method is available, call the method. And the same thing happens for the container class. You know, if we were writing this in Python, it would look like this. There's a class called GTK container with a method called add, and it takes the self parameter and a widget that we want to add to the container. And in C, it would look like this. It's a function called GTK container add with the self parameter called container and the first parameter called widget. And it takes the widget and adds it into the container. But that's all in C. Oh, that's what I was just explaining. Get the class structure. If the method is implemented, call the method. And for example, if you type in a search engine how to extend Python from C, how do you write a little C module to extend the Python language with different types or different classes? Because the Python interpreter is written itself in C, and it provides an API to extend it. So if you look at the manual for how to extend Python in C, you would see something like this. Well, in the C side, in the Python interpreter, everything is a Py object. And functions that extend Python from C take two parameters, one Py object for the self parameter of a method, and another Py object with all the arguments. So the manual would tell you, well, you need to call this special function to parse the arguments. And here you specify that it only takes a single argument and it's a string. So please put the string in this variable name. Then you do whatever you need to do in C. In this function, we're just calling printf to say hello name, the name you passed. You know, your function can do anything it wants here. And then finally, it needs to construct an appropriate return value for Python. And the way you do that in the C part of Python is with this magic incantation. The details of this do not interest us right now. That's just the way Python modules are written. So in effect, what we are doing here is implementing a method for a class. If we had a label class which inherits from widget, and we wanted to implement a setText method for it, that's what you would be able to call in the end. And that's the way. This is pretty much the way you would implement it in the C part of Python. You would take the self object and somehow extract the GTK label from it. This is some magic which we will not see right now. You would parse the arguments in the same way. This function takes the args, parse a string argument, and put it in the text variable. Call the C function that lets you set the text in a label, and construct the magic return value for Python functions. So what's a language binding? What are these language bindings we're talking about? It's just a wrapper around some libraries written in C or written in Rust that allows that library to be called from another programming language. Very often a higher level language. For example, the Gnome libraries are written in C and Rust, and you can call them from Python or from JavaScript or from other Rust programs or from Ruby, Scheme, Perl. And ideally, the language binding takes care so that the binding actually looks like it's written in that language. It's not like, it doesn't look like a wrapper. It actually looks like part of the language's standard library. So let me tell you the story behind all this. Back in 1997, when we announced Gnome, the Gtk API was very small, and the Gnome APIs we provided were very, very limited and very small. You know, Gtk had only a few widgets, and the programming languages that were in vogue back then were, you know, C++, Objective-C, Python. I'm not even sure if Python was around then. Perl was definitely around. And the API was so small that people thought it's actually convenient to wrap every GTK function by hand and expose it in their favorite programming language. So, you know, you would write a wrapper for GTK container add, a wrapper for GTK widget show, a wrapper for GTK entry set text. And we had so few methods that this was actually, you know, it seemed doable, very doable by a few people. It was very error prone because all these wrappers, they kind of look the same. So you tend to do a lot of cut and paste, and we all know that doing cut and paste programming, it works, but it's very prone to errors, and you miss things. And well, there was a lot of duplicated code back then. The next year after that, Red Hat started writing their distributions installer in Python. Back then, Fedora didn't even exist. It was still called Red Hat Linux. And if I'm not mistaken, it was the first distribution that took their installer that had been written in C and rewrote it, or in some scripting language, and rewrote it in a high-level language with a GUI. Red Hat actually took their installer for their distribution and rewrote it in Python and put in a lot of work into PyGTK, the Python bindings for GTK, to allow the installer to be written in there. This was pretty revolutionary back then. So that's when PyGTK started to get really, really good, because it was being put into production in a real project. Back then, I worked in Red Hat Labs, and a few cubicles away from mine was the guy who was rewriting the Python installer, the Red Hat installer in Python, Matthew Wilson, a good friend. And every day I would go to his cubicle and ask him, oh, hey, how are you doing with the installer? And he's like, oh, you know, today I wrapped this and that functions from GTK to be callable from Python, and I'm running into some problems with the memory management, but I fixed them this way. It was a pretty fun time to be around. So back then, one thing that people started doing is there was so much duplicated code written by hand that people started finding some patterns to make things, patterns that would allow making things more automatic. So for example, GTK is full of widget classes, and each class has methods, and each method has arguments of different types. So they started writing these machine readable descriptions of the API. This is written in something that looks vaguely like Lisp or like Scheme. We were very keen on using Scheme back then because it's a beautiful language, very easy to parse, very easy to process. So you would say, okay, we have a class called GTK widget, and it has a method called show, and it takes no arguments, so nil, and it returns no value, so nil. Perfect. And that way, you could have a program that took these descriptions and automatically generated the code to call the C functions from GTK. Here's another method in GTK widget class. It's called Widget Hide. So it's called hide, no arguments, no return value. And people started writing little preprocessors that took these machine readable descriptions and wrote the language binding mostly automatically. And I say mostly because back then we didn't really grasp all the implications of wrapping a very rich C API in a higher level language. You need to consider how to find the libraries at runtime, what the classes are called, what the method names are called, how you glue together the method name with the class so you can have the full function name in C, how to convert the argument types. When you have a number in Python, it's a PyObject of type integer or whatever, but you need to convert that into a C integer and to build up a function call that you can call in C or in assembly. So how do you do that? And that's what we were figuring out back then. That's what I was just talking about. If you have the GTK container class and the add method, well, the machine readable description would say something like the method is called add, so the full function name can be derived as GTK container add. And for arguments, it takes a single one of type widget. So you need to take, and it returns nothing. So you would need to convert the Python object for the widget into a GTK object and pass it to the GTK container function. And then the machine readable description becomes an exercise in describing all the C types, but in a format that the language binding can understand. So for example, this is the GTK color is the C structure we used back then to describe RGB red, green, blue colors. Each of the red, green, blue values is a byte, so it's a good char unsigned character. And the description would probably look like something like this. It's a struct, not a class, called GTK color, and it has 3 fields RGB. They are all of the same type. So this would tell the language binding generator a few things. It would tell it the name of the struct. It would tell it the fields, the types, and something very important when calling functions in C is that you have to know, for example, the alignment of the fields. Different microprocessors have different alignment requirements for fields in variables that you can access in memory. So the language binding has to figure that out from the description of the struct. So the GTK API got richer and richer. And it's basically a way to fake object-oriented programming in C, so that you can define classes with methods and signals and events and properties at runtime. And since this is all written in C, it has to have many, many considerations for memory management. C is not a garbage collected language. You actually need to manage your memory by hand. So when you get past a pointer to an object, you have to know if that object now belongs to you, you own a reference to the object, or if you are just borrowing a reference to the outside and you should not free it when you are done. So you have to know things like, if we have one of the GTK colors from before, can you just copy that value in memory? Can you do a bit-by-bit copy and get the same value? Is that valid? If you do a bit-by-bit copy of an object instance, that's not going to work because it has an internal pointer to the class, and you cannot just have raw copies to pointers. You need to increase the reference count, things like that. So the GTK API has to consider all of that, and the language binding has to know all of that to make memory management work correctly. So, for example, the way the GTK API works is that this is where GTK widget defines one of its events, which GTK calls signals. So when you have a control in the screen, a widget, and you press a mouse button over it, the widget emits this event or signal called button press event. And the way it gets declared is, okay, we have a signal called button press event. And who can emit that? Well, all subclasses of GTK widget class. The event has a Boolean return value, which means whether the event was handled or not. It takes a single argument, which is of type event. And if you look at an event structure, that event structure will have things like the coordinates where the mouse was pressed, the number of the mouse button that was pressed, the timestamp, an identifier for the window, things like that. So this is how you would register a signal at runtime. But one of the nice things about the G-object system is that later it allows you to query which signals are available. You do not just register them and call them or emit them. You can also query a list of the signals that are available. So you could imagine a language binding going and asking, okay, let me query the signals for this class. And then that will let me add dynamically those signals at runtime to my language binding. But that's for dynamic languages. We have two types of programming languages, static and dynamic. In static languages like C++ and Rust, everything has to be typed in advance by hand. Everything has to be defined in advance. Then you run the compiler, and then you can run your program. So everything needs to be pre-generated or written by hand in advance. Rust and C++ do not make it possible to add new methods to a class at runtime. They need to be predefined. So you cannot just have a binding that runs gsignal query and goes and adds a bunch of methods at runtime to the class. However, in languages like Python or JavaScript, that is actually possible. You know how Python and JavaScript allow you to monkey patch all the things all the time at runtime. You can have a class and add a method to it dynamically, or remove a method, or even change the argument types. It's really, really great for prototyping. It's really, really messy for final production code, but the languages allow you to do that. And that's exactly what language bindings for dynamic languages work. They query, or they get a list of the available methods and signals that they would like to have for GTK objects, and they just generate them at runtime and add them to the Python or JavaScript classes. So back in the time of Gnome 2, I already talked about this. We had a lot of machine-readable descriptions of the APIs. Those machine-readable descriptions were not written automatically. They were written by hand, so people had to go through the header files in C for GTK and add manual descriptions to the machine-readable code. There was a lot of cut and paste from bindings because they did not really share. They did not officially share these machine-readable descriptions. Often what happened is that people would take the language binding that was the most developed, the Python or the Scheme one, I don't remember which one it was. They would take the machine-readable descriptions from there because they were already written, copy and paste them to their language binding, write their own generator, and then look at the generated code and maybe modify it by hand, or maybe modify their tools to insert some tweaks specific for their language. So there was a lot of manual work on top of the automation to generate the bindings. For Gnome 3, we wanted something better. We wanted to avoid most of the manual work required to write those machine-readable descriptions of the API. And people came up with this thing called G-object introspection. Back then, languages which allowed you to query the things available in the language at runtime were called introspectable. Nowadays, it's called reflection. For example, Java has reflection, C# has reflection, Python has reflection, because they are also more or less dynamic languages. And the introspection we wanted to have for GTK and GObject was just that, just to be able to query a description of the whole API from a program, not to write that description by hand. So the idea was that someone would write a platform library in C, like GTK or Gnome Desktop or librsvg or GStreamer, all the libraries we use for Gnome. Then something would generate a machine-readable description of the whole API automatically. And then the language binding would just be a program that takes that machine-readable description and generates the language binding mostly automatically as possible, right? So I already talked about how when you write an API in C, you need to be very mindful of things like memory management. So, for example, GTK widget getParent is the method on the GTK widget class that you use to get the widget's parent. Widgets are arranged as a tree, logically as a tree, just like the DOM elements in a web page. So if you have a widget, you can ask for its parent container. And all widgets have a parent except the top level windows, which are top level, so they don't have a parent. So the parent can be null, right? So the language binding needs to know that this function can return an actual widget, or it can return null. It is actually valid for this function to return null. So how do we write a machine-readable description? Well, that machine-readable description is written as part of the documentation comments. The way GTK is written is when you start a C comment with /**, it's documentation, just like in Java, I think. So you have, the name of the method or the function, the list of arguments and their description, the human readable description for the documentation, human readable description of the return value, and these two things. And those two things, where it says transfer none, it means that this function will not add an extra reference count to the object it is returning. It's just letting you look at the parent of the widget, but you are not the owner of the parent. You do not get your own reference to the parent. You can just look at it and leave it be. You don't need to free it when you're done. And the return value can also be null, because a widget can have no parent. So the language binding needs to know that the return value can actually be null. For people not familiar with the difference between actual values and null values, we have an explanation with toilet paper here. When you have toilet paper, you have a non-zero amount of toilet paper. When you are out of toilet paper, you have 0 meters of toilet paper. If the roll is not even there, it's null. And undefined is, who knows, there may not even be a toilet paper holder in the wall. So how do these machine-readable descriptions actually look like when they are extracted from the library? Since GObject introspection was written in the early 2000s, of course, people picked XML as a language. It's not a bad choice, it's infinitely extensible. It allows nesting and a tree of elements. So XML is not a bad choice. It's perhaps not the prettiest language around, but it works fine. So if you look at this file in your computer, I'll tell you later where it lives. GIR means GObject introspection repository for the GTK 3.0 library. So this library, and it has things like this. Each library has its own namespace. The namespace here is GTK. The library API version is 3.0. And the actual binary in your hard drive is called libgtk3.so.0. It also depends on this other shared library, so the language binding has to be sure to link this other library at runtime. The prefix for the library identifiers is this. The symbol prefix is this. This is just the prefix that is prepended to every function name. Let's look at the definition for the GTK entry class and one of its methods. So in C, the thing is called GTK entry, but the name you want to export without the namespace for language bindings is just entry. Its parent class is its widget class. There's a special function to identify the numeric type for that class, which is called GTK entry type. Even the documentation is embedded within this machine readable description, so that the language binding can take this documentation and present it in, whatever documentation framework the language allows. So what does the GTK entry class, what interfaces does it implement? Well, it implements one of the accessibility interfaces. It's buildable from a Glade file or GTK builder file. It implements the editable interface that's just part of the GTK API. But this is all embedded in the machine readable description, the GIR file. Now let's look at a method. GTK defines this method for GTK entry called getText. It allows you to get the text someone typed inside the entry. So it takes an entry for a parameter and it returns a string. This is what a string looks like in C. So the machine readable description, it's a method. The name is getText. The C function name is GTK entry getText, the whole thing here. And first, we specify its return value. Transfer ownership none means that you only get a reference to the string. You do not get an actual copy of the string, so the caller should not free it. And it's of type const gchar pointer, and it's actually a UTF-8 string. We specify that for the convenience of the language binding. For example, not all programming languages represent strings in the same way internally. GTK prefers UTF-8 encoding. Python, I think Python uses UTF-16, or I'm not sure if Python 3 uses UTF-8, but Python 2 definitely use UTF-16. Java prefers UTF-16. The Windows API prefers WTF-16, which is slightly different from UTF. And now the function parameters. This function GTK entry getText takes a single parameter called entry. Again, transfer ownership none means that the function just gets a reference. It does not get a new one. And here it says the type of the parameter. Anyway, the idea is that this whole XML chunk defines exactly everything one needs to know to be able to call this function from another programming language. Even for record or struct definitions, for example, this is the type GTK rectangle. It's not an object, it's not a class, it's just a regular struct. It has 4 fields, x, y, for the upper left corner of the rectangle, and the width and the height. They're all integers. And this is how we would describe it in the GIR file. This is automatically generated. There is code in the GIR generator that reads this C structure and emits this. The type is called rectangle. This is the C name for the type. And it has a bunch of fields. The first one is called X. It is writable. It's not a private field. It's of type int. The C type, the glib type, and the C type. The second field is called Y. The third field is called width. The fourth field is called height. Again, this lets the language binding construct its own representation based on this description. Now, the Gnome APIs have grown a lot over time. GTK is absolutely enormous right now. I don't know how big it is, but it has more than 100 classes, thousands of methods, thousands of types, a few hundred utility types. It's pretty huge. So when the generator for the G-object introspection repository files runs, if you look in this directory in your machine, you will see that the gear file for GTK is like 9 megabytes or 7 megabytes. And the gear file for glib is like 4 megabytes. And the glib file for, I don't know, librsvg is a couple of hundred kilobytes. You wouldn't really want a language binding for Python or JavaScript to have to parse all of that XML code in the beginning. Because it would just slow down the startup and consume extra memory in each separate process. So people wrote a compiler that takes the gear files and compiles them to much smaller binary files with an extension typelib. If you look in this directory in your machine, you'll see a bunch of typelib files. And these contain the same thing as the XML in the gear files, but they are much smaller. And one important thing is that they can be memory mapped by the kernel into the process, into the memory of each process. And that way they do not get duplicated in memory. If you run 10 Python applications, 10 Python GTK applications at the same time, you get a single copy of the typelib in memory, not 10 copies. This is really important for reducing memory consumption. So this is a very important step that we take to make dynamic languages consume less memory. Also, internally, this typelib file contains information about all the classes, all the methods, all the parameters, the struct fields, everything. And that can be accessed from the memory mapped chunk without reconstructing things or without reconstructing too many things in the memory space of each process. So it really allows for a lot of memory reduction. Now, that's the way language bindings work right now. They allow us to take low-level libraries written in C or in Rust or C++ that expose a C API to have a machine-readable description and to later use that machine-readable description to generate a language binding, to generate the code that will allow us to call that low-level library from a higher-level language. I work a lot in the Rust community. I'm the maintainer of librsvg for Gnome, which is nowadays written in Rust, but exports as C API. And one thing they are saying in the Rust community is this. We should have a third ABI. An ABI is an application binary interface. It is what you need to know to be able to call a compiled library from assembly code, which is what essentially C and Rust code compile to. And the C ABI, which is what every GNOME program uses to call into GTK, it tells you things like, okay, if you want to call a function, you need to know its symbol name, and that way the linker, one of the low-level tools along with the compiler, the linker will find that function for you in your memory space. And then the first argument is passed in this CPU register, and the second argument is passed in this other CPU register. It's really, really, really low-level stuff. But historically, we have been limited by the C ABI to call anything. Like, for example, C++ does not have a C ABI. It has its own thing. And it's really, really hard to call C++ methods from Python, for example, because they do not have the same ABI as basic C libraries. So it's really hard to have things like exception handling across languages because there's just no standard ABI for that. The only standard ABI we have for cross-language communication is the C ABI. In Windows, we also have COM, C-O-M, which is an older ABI defined by Microsoft to call the things across languages, but that's also internally based on the C ABI. So we have always lived with that limit for years and years and years. And I am very happy to see that nowadays people are talking about, okay, we have the standard C ABI, which is very limited, but it works fine. What if we had a new one? What if we started defining a new ABI with a richer type system, with richer considerations for things like memory management across programming languages, I don't know, unwinding, exception handling, all the things that all these high-level languages let you do? What if the ABI were standard and actually considered that? And then they said, well, what if the ABI had a way to actually encode information about the types and layouts, which is actually something that G-object and G-object introspection already do? And it should be usable at compile time and runtime to provide type information, which we already do. Compilers should be able to import ABI libraries directly. Okay, that's really interesting. We don't do that yet. But you know, via the G-object introspection libraries for Python and JavaScript, it's debatable whether they are interpreters or compilers, but you know, the Python interpreter loads our PyGObject thing at runtime and generates this API description based on the type information provided exactly like this person is proposing. So Gnome has already gone there. We have already been able to extend the C ABI with machine-readable descriptions that other programming language runtimes or compilers can use to extend their own APIs. So there's prior art for this. We have already gone there. So I want to invite people who are interested in low-level parts of the platform, the programming languages, the compilers, the interpreters, the language bindings, to investigate things like this, to actually try to extend things for the future. We have lived with the C ABI since, you know, the late 70s, early 80s. The System 5 ABI for Unix in C was defined, I don't know, in the 80s maybe. And we have been using it ever since, and it has not really been extended. The only thing that changes is that every time a CPU architecture comes about, people write a new C ABI for it, but everyone has to use it. So I say that it's time now for having a richer ABI that all programming languages can use to call into each other. So G-object has gone there. We know some things that work. We know some things that don't work. So I want to invite you to work on this if you're interested in the low-level parts of the language. And if you're interested in higher-level things like writing applications, please do that. Write them in high-level languages. Don't write them in C. C is being phased out slowly. So work on tools, save the world, work on applications, and save the users. And I think that's all I have for now. So I'll be happy to take questions if we have time. Thank you.
That was good. Yeah, thank you for that. That was a very, very long and good session. Actually,
Thank you.
so let's let's entertain some question. Someone said, "How do I start with GTK?" I mean, I was expecting that question actually. How do I start with GTK? That's a question someone asked, and then another person said, "How do a Python developer start contributing?" So those are the two questions.
So I just typed both questions into the chat. The first one, how do I start with GTK? The best way is to decide what programming language you want to use. Maybe Python, maybe JavaScript, maybe Rust, I don't know. Just look for GTK my language name tutorial, like GTK Python tutorial or GTK JavaScript tutorial. You will find them. I can post a few links after the session is over, just so I don't waste time right now. I'll paste some links in the chat. Second question, how do Python developers start contributing? I'm not sure if you mean contributing to the language binding or to writing applications. If you want to write applications, it's the same answer as before. Just Google for Python GTK or Python GObject tutorial, and you'll find that. If you want to work on the language binding, pardon me, I'll post a link to the GObject introspection libraries and the counterpart in Python, so you can look at it there. If you actually want to work on PyGObject, you need to be a bit familiar with C and maybe read the Python tutorials for how to extend Python with C. That will give you a good idea of the level of things you need to write there. So I'll post a couple of links when the session is over. Ibuka just posted another question in the chat. When you say low-level language, can you explain it a little? What are the languages you call low-level? Okay, so there's a very, very old debate in the programming languages community about what is low-level and what is high-level. And it's all relative, you know. If you're an assembly language programmer, you would call C high-level. But if you're a Python programmer, you look at C and you say, oh, this is really low-level. So the basic distinction is how much irrelevant stuff you need to consider when you're writing your code. Like if you're writing Python, you can create new objects at any time. You don't even need to worry about freeing them because the language runtime takes care of that for you. It has garbage collection. You can just build a list of things or an array or a vector. And if it runs out of memory, well, the language throws an exception and you catch it. And if you catch it, you can recover. And if you don't catch it, the program just crashes, which is probably fine if you run out of memory. But if you're working in a lower level language like C, when you allocate your memory, you explicitly have to call functions to allocate the memory and then initialize it. So that's kind of more work, more irrelevant work you have to do. What you want to do in your program is not allocate memory and initialize it. You want an object. You want to create an instance of a new object, right? Or if you want an array of things, you have to multiply the size of each element by the length of your array and then allocate that much memory. And then you have to check if the allocation succeeded or if you ran out of memory, and you have to handle everything by hand. And then finally, when you're done with the memory, you need to free it by hand. Otherwise, you create a memory leak because the C language does not have a garbage collector. So that's kind of the basic distinction between a low-level and a high-level language. In a high-level language, a lot of those things that have to do with administering the things that the computer does are done automatically. And in a low-level language, you actually have to do those things by hand. There's good reasons for that. At the CPU level, the assembly language instructions you can use, they are just like take a memory location, copy the contents of that memory location into a CPU register, add these two registers together, move the value back into memory, check if a value is 0. If it's 0, jump to another instruction. You don't even have functions. You don't even have objects or classes. That's all constructed by the language runtimes of higher level languages. So it's basically about how fine-grained are the tools that you use to build your programs. I hope that explains it a little. Patrick is asking if how long before this meeting ends, and I guess we're done now. Unless anyone has any more questions, I think it's time for the next.
Okay, thank you, Federico. That was awesome. Okay, so quickly moving to the next item. And please, if you have a question, keep dropping them. We'll answer them. All right, so you can follow Frederica on social media, and you can even chat him up now on the public chat, and then he would respond to you as long as he's available on this meeting. So to the next one, I'll be calling someone. So thank you, Federico. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, bye. All right, so I'll be calling the next person, and that's the person that is in charge of the onboarding initiative. He's the person I've actually worked with worked with majorly in Gnome generally, and that has to do with person of Sri Krishna, and then it will take us.
Ayo, I think you're making a mistake. It's Saloni before Sri.
Okay, I was thinking they're not available. Sorry for that. Oh, Saloni, I'm very sorry for that. Yeah, so we'll be starting with open source while in university. Some of us here are university students, and then it would be nice for us to know how we can start contributing to open source while we are in school, in university. So I would like to call on Saloni Gag and Amit Sagtani. Saloni, hi. Hi, Saloni.
Hi, thanks for the welcome. I'm happy to be here. I'm Saloni, and I'll be co-presenting this talk along with Amit.
Yeah. Hi everyone, I am Amit. So,
Hey, Amit, welcome.
Someone is already presenting. How can I share my screen?
Okay. You have the presenter. You have the presenter role now, Amit. So I think you can upload your slide, and if you want to share your screen, you will see the option down button, or you click the options and then you share your screen from it. Either ways you can do.
Okay. Okay. So is it visible now?
Yep, it's visible. I can see your slide.
Okay. So let us start. So first of all, we would like to introduce ourselves. So Saloni.
Yeah, I'm Saloni Garg, and I am an open source contributor. And I love data science and DevRel, that is developer relations. I just love open source and contributing to open source and encouraging more people to contribute to open source. I'm currently working as a data scientist at Wayfair. And yeah, over to you, Amit.
Yeah, hi. Like I recently completed my university studies and joined my first company like at Red Hat, and I was part of Google Summer of Code and also mentored it. So like I've been pretty involved with open source from 3 years. So it is a very good journey so far. So like the most of the things which we are going to talk are I think already covered in the previous talks. So like I'll start. So like first, like the first questions, like which university student like who recently joined us or a university might question himself that I just started my college studies, so am I invited to open source world, so am I eligible to contribute, because like I've just started my studies and I know the like small programming, like I'm just a beginner, so is it made for me? But like what like we like from our experience as a student, like we can say that it is the best time to start contributing to open source. Like university, during university we can learn many things, and like we can implement them in real life projects and work with the great teams, the community. So it is the best time to start. Next is like another thing, like many students think like is open source all about programming, so like all you have to do is code, or like I can contribute in some other ways as well. So like there are many other ways. So like if you are good in like designing, creating new new digital painting, creating logos, and creating like website designing or most of the front end part, you can contribute as a like in the that field. Or like there are many applications which are in multi-language, or you want to translate some existing language, say in your native language, and you can contribute in that way by providing the translation for the existing apps. And next is the management. Suppose you say you are interested in organizing some event, or like handling like how things go, like how to conduct some event from starting, like reaching out to like the sponsors, the speakers, like planning out things, like how to select place for the conference, whom to invite. If you're interested in that thing, you can also start with like those things. And say suppose you like writing, say you are interested in writing blogs, or you are interested in creating the video tutorials of some open source projects, that is also a very good way to start. So suppose like you can test various applications which are available for free, and you can write blogs like how like these things work, how to install them, how to run them, or maybe create the video tutorials on like to make it easy for peoples by writing documentation also. So that there are many ways other than programming you can contribute in the open source. Now there are some fun reasons like why you should start contributing. So first one is travel. Like who do not want to travel? So by contributing to open source, you will definitely get a lot of chance to travel to different countries, present your work, and then it is new friends. Like you will definitely going to make new friends. Like you will be in your university who have friends from like different countries, like not only your state, town, or country. Like you will have friends from like different time zones. So next is like on the stage. So like you will get many opportunities where you can like go to different countries, like give the talks. And the good thing is like this will be like most of the cases this will be sponsored by the organizers. So like during the university time, it is the best. Like you will get a chance to go different countries, present your work, and add more people to the project you are working with. And like and one certain thing, like when you start doing something in university, you have in the mind that will I get a job from doing that? But like if you start contributing to open source, and like if time passes and you do like you are doing it like with interest, like the things will change. Like the people from other companies will start contacting you, like if you can work for us. Because like these days most of the people, just companies, the HRs, they look at your LinkedIn, the GitHub profiles, they see your like the contributions in the open source projects, like your code style, your everything, like you are doing, like not only in the code field, but if you are looking for jobs in other than programming, like suppose you want to learn about event management, so you can conduct many events, open source events, and like you can write about that, like you have a good like resume, like I have done this, like this, that, and like and everything. And these are the things like HR of the companies, they look at these days, and you will get many referrals, and it will be very easy to get job by this way too. Now coming to different opportunities and like how you can help as a student. So there are some programs, like well-known programs like Google Summer of Code, which is for the coding, and Google Season of Docs, like if you want to like work in documenting the things, this is the good place to start. Then there are events which are for the girls only, like the Outreachy, the Rail Summer of Code, and other similar programs. These like aims at getting students into the coding environment and the open source world. And like you can also help in effective outreach. Suppose you want to get engaged with an uh, uh, communities, like to like you have skills to like promote some events, or like how you can get more speakers, more attendees, so you can show your skills and help the communities. Now you can also volunteer at the many events, conferences, like, and like if you are contributing from large time, so you will become good at that thing, so you can help as a mentor to the beginners. You can help many new contributors, like how they can start. And the most important thing is you can bring your new perspectives. Suppose like there are some existing apps, so like you have your ideas, so we can do this way, that thing to improve it, or to like how we can make it more interactive or anything. Like those ideas are more than welcome in the open source communities. You can always contribute by that way. Okay, Saloni will now continue with the next slides.
Thanks, Amit. So you can also conduct events in your university as a part of the Gnome University Outreach event. So I'll briefly tell you what Gnome University Outreach event stands for. We at Gnome are always trying to make the experience of starting into the world of open source easier for students like you. I'm not sure how many students are listening to this talk, but this might be something very useful for all the students out there. So, all the students who want to step into the world of open source, who have not yet contributed anywhere but just want to get started, Gnome University Outreach is one of the very welcoming initiatives for all those students, and we always try to make the experience better for you. So first, and like one of the aspects of starting into this initiative can be conducting an event in your own university. So how this will help is that with this event conducting in your university, you will be able to make new friends who are into the same field, who also want to contribute to open source, and new friends who will also know about GNOME. And you can try to explore GNOME, GTK, all the repositories together. Another thing is, so let me just briefly explain that how does it catalyzes the process of onboarding new contributors. So this is a brief explanation of how university outreach program begins. First step here, as you can see, student gets involved with the with GNOME in university outreach program. So first of all, you get involved with GNOME. For example, this can be done through multiple ways. Either you can look up GNOME online and you just find repositories used in GNOME interesting and you just want to contribute, or you meet some person who is an avid contributor to GNOME repositories and he tells you about what is happening at GNOME and you find that interesting. Whichever way it happens, so that's your first interaction with the GNOME community. Now, the second thing is gets prerequisite knowledge transfer from university outreach team. So once you indicate this to us at the outreach team that you are interested in contributing, you are interested in getting involved with Gnome Foundation. So one of our members will reach out to you, and you'll get a prerequisite knowledge, and you'll get a set of skill set that you should prepare before contributing to Gnome. There's no limit, there's no foundation as to what you should or you must learn before contributing. You can contribute in any of the repositories with whatever skill set that you already have. But it's always good to get insights from somebody who is contributing from a long time. So one of us will reach out to you personally. Next is using the knowledge they organize events and help students at their own universities. So as you might already understand that it will be difficult for us at Gnome to reach out to every individual student. So once you have been reached out by one of us and you have been told what prerequisite knowledge is required, you will be the one who will be transferring that knowledge and sharing the resources and all that, and enlightening your fellow classmates and batchmates and all of them. So the next thing is the larger pool of students from events get onboarded with projects and initiatives. So with this, we'll be forming a larger community that's interested in Gnome and open source contributions in general. And you will work together in your own university, or you can be a part of a larger team, whichever way you like. If you are interested in a specific repository, you will be given mentors and maintainers of that particular repository, and they'll reach out to you, and you can interact with them personally as well. So that's how we are trying to make the experience better for beginners in open source. Next slide. Yeah. So regional student communities with campus representatives. There is this new concept that we are introducing of campus representatives. So if you're somebody who has leadership skills and who likes to form communities and who just wants to participate in the university outreach program and help us forming larger communities, you can become a campus representative with us. What campus representatives do is, this will come in the next slide, but how campus representatives help us is that the small communities that are on the campus are easily manageable. So campus representative is basically the key point of contact for all the, for all the events or conferences, summits, competitions, and everything that Gnome is going to organize on your campus. And so the more active leaders, that is, more people will be active and they'll lead the community. So everything will become easily manageable. Next is more participation in local events. So yeah, as you can already imagine, that there will be more participation in the local events that will be organized on specific campuses, university campuses. Next slide. So how campus representatives help? First of all, they are the key points of contact. So campus representative will be directly in touch with one of the contributors, maintainers, the Gnome Foundation members, and we'll be sharing resources and some resources and some links and all of that, some goodies and all of that with the campus representatives, so that they can organize events, hackathons, and everything related to community engagement on their own respective campuses. Next thing is, they'll be locally active. They'll be the people who will be the most active, or the leaders of the community, basically. Yeah. So they will be already okay. Mentoring FOSS programs. Can you please turn the slide back? Yeah. So I was just explaining the locally active part. So the campus leaders, the campus representatives will be the ones who are already trusted by students in their respective colleges, who have emerged as leaders in their time of study, and hence they will be able to take up leadership roles in the future as well. They'll start with taking leadership role in the local student communities, and they can definitely learn leadership skills and community management skills and all of that, and can emerge as better leaders in the future. Now, mentoring FOSS programs is next level fun. All of that I just spoke about was about um participating into FOSS as a contributor. Now let's talk about participating into FOSS as a mentor. So once you have contributed enough, and there's nothing that defines enough, it's definitely relative to all of us. Now, when you have contributed enough, when you think that you have contributed enough, and you are now able to mentor students, this can happen as quickly as within the first month of contributing, of starting to contribute. So when you think you have the desire and the skills to mentor somebody who is just beginning with open source, so that becomes that makes the journey of open source even more interesting for you. Some GSOC students whom you mentored in the past are now your colleagues or co-mentors. So this is not a very uncommon sight, that somebody that you mentored in Google Summer of Code or Outreachy or any of the programs has now met you as your colleague or co-maintainer, or has met you in some or the other way in your same company. And this is very great to see that a lot of people in the community, and your circle, your professional circle, becomes even bigger. Next thing is GSOC students who stay help onboard and outreach new contributors. So the GSOC students who stay, who are still, uh, connected with the community, who are still engaged with the community, they help onboarding and outreaching to new contributors. So this is another interesting way how you can, emerge as a mentor, and how you can also participate in the outreach process and help onboarding new beginners, helping people who are just starting with open source, in making the process easy for them and all of that. But not a lot of GSOC students stick around. So what's the solution? And we have also seen this, pretty much, that not all of the GSOC students stay engaged with their communities after the GSOC period ends. Why is that? That's mostly because most of the students are looking for jobs and internships and all of that, and they cannot devote much time to the open source contributions. So this mainly happens during college, that they cannot stay much engaged with the community that they were once an active part of. So this happens pretty much. But what's the solution? So students need to they can mentor the programs, they can make uh, the onboarding process easier for someone who is just a beginner, and they can always stay engaged. But this is also pretty understandable that the students cannot find much time for contributions and for mentoring and for all of that. But if you have time, if you think you have time, you can devote a little bit of time. It is very precious, and it is very much valued by all of the open source organization members. And yeah, this will be much appreciated. Sometimes it doesn't matter how much you share, how much share you get out of the pie. It matters how big the pie is. Now, how can you help as a mentor? So it's not good to call you as a mentor. People generally prefer the word guide better, because mentorship might sometimes give an idea that you might need to devote a lot of time into the mentoring process, and the mentee, the person whom you are mentoring, might come up with a lot of questions to you, and you might have to this might involve a lot of hassle and all of that. But this is not generally the thing. uh, your main task is to guide the person who is just starting, and share your resources, share your knowledge, your experience, and how you get out of the problem, how you faced the problems, which problems did you face when you were just starting up, and how did you manage, how did you cope up with them. So that's pretty much the process, and that's pretty much the task that we expect from a guide or a mentor. So inspire, guide, and network. Help build us a professional network. And this not only helps the mentee or the student improve their professional network, rather, this is very often the case that the mentor gets to meet a lot of new people because of the mentee, because of the thing that they are mentoring, this open source project. So how it helps your project's growth. Now, stepping up on the ladder one step more, even if you, for example, if you have mentored a project for some while and you think you are able to maintain a project, so this even helps, this even makes the journey even more interesting. So evolve your project contributors network. So if you are maintaining some project with with engaged participation in the community, and with community management and all of that, you can definitely evolve your project's contributor network. You can increase the number of contributors, the number of people that are interested in your own project, the project that you are maintaining. And share your pie. Definitely share your resources, share whatever knowledge that you have, and whichever way you can help the beginners. Do more with the design and evolution of the project. With more people getting engaged into the community, you can definitely factor in the new perspectives and make something new out of that. 360-degree growth for your project. So this will come up as a 360-degree growth of your project. Project growth from all the angles, from whether it's about writing, it's about outreach or technical improvements and all of that. When a lot of people join in, a lot of students join in, it's 360-degree growth for your project. So how far we have reached to date? We are just trying to make the process of onboarding easier for students in the Gnome University Outreach Initiative. So we have conducted our very first university outreach event, and that was pretty successful. And we were a lot of students actually attended that event, and it was a good start. Now we have our wiki page in place. I'll post the link in the chat. And we have onboarded a few mentors already. A few people have already signed up to share their to contribute and to devote their time into helping the beginners. And we have planned some future events as well. We have some events lined up that will be holding very soon. And lastly, we have figured out the roadmap for our next set of actions. So we'll be sharing the entire timeline and the events and what events are coming up and where they are coming up and who will be the speakers and all of that. We'll share all that very soon. This is just a screenshot of our very first university outreach event. So it happened on May 10th. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for listening to us. And I'd really like to encourage you to just start contributing and help the beginners or help yourself, and let's grow the open source community together. Thank you so much.
Yeah, coming to questions, like we have, how can we contribute via writing? So the best way will be like to go to the GitLab of the Gnome. Like you can see different projects listed there. Then go through different projects. You will see a README file there, which describe like how to maybe like that project and make your changes. You can start by like running some project and then improving the documentation, like the flow. It has written like how to start and everything, like any bug or any typo you found there, you can start writing that. So that will be a good place to start. So any more questions? So can I start a Gnome community in my school?
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you, Amit. I was just about reading that same question. Can I start a GNOME community in my school? Would if yes, would GNOME help fund that? I think. Yep.
Yeah, so like as a part of Gnome University outreach, like we can like approve some funds to conduct the events. So that may include some expenses you might occur for like distributing some goodies or some like if it is an in-person event, we can help with some funding with the event location. So yes, you can send us the overall like expenditure like with like approximated expenses report, and we have some funds like to like conduct those events. And also like we can help with like providing the speakers, the materials, or the mentors from the Gnome side, like those can help like conduct those events.
Yeah, and I'll share a link where you can pre-register and indicate your interest. Like, which way are you, uh, trying to contribute? Which way are you interested in contributing?
Okay, thank you, Saloni. Thank you, Amit. There was an awesome section. And for the students in the house, and then I mean, I would advise you to actually take up this opportunity. Someone like me, I don't even know what is called programming or open source or technical while I was in school. So, I mean, I couldn't, I didn't know all of this existed. So, I mean, you guys are lucky. Thank you, Saloni. Thank you, Amit.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
And yeah, and we were moving on to the next event. And finally, I can call this man. I've been wanting to call him. They did not allow me. Finally, I can call him. I can call the person of Ram Krishna, and then he will be talking to us on how to use an inclusive language in an open source community. Hi, Sri.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me. Let me upload my. Can you all hear me properly?
Yes, Sri, we can hear you.
All right, excellent. Give me 1 second while I try to upload. Okay, sorry, I'm back.
Okay. Welcome. That's good.
There's an echo here.
Okay, Sri, you have the presentation, presenter role now, so you can upload your slide, then, or you can share your screen. Who wants to continue?
Having a little trouble.
Okay, okay. So while we're waiting for Sri, I just want us to, be ready for what will come after Sri's presentation. I mean, that will be a time that we can all ask whatever question that we have. It will be a panel section, and I'm really, really, really looking forward having these guys on board. So, be ready to have something gaudy, be ready to have Perry, and then be ready to have Rhodes, and be ready to have Sri himself too on the panel, and then they would be taking you through like they will be giving a lot of answers to what I know, and then what we feel that is problems, and then what are the solutions to contributing to open source in Africa generally. So let's just wait a bit for Sri to fix his technical issues.
Hopefully now that's much better. What happened was the web. I have two Firefoxes, and one of the Firefoxes crashed and wouldn't load up again, and so it was still holding on to the microphone. So I had to do a reboot to get that going. All right, let me see if I can now upload my. That's much better.
Okay, welcome back, Sri.
Yep.
And if you don't mind, you can increase your volume a bit so that our people can hear you more better.
Okay. Is this better now?
Yeah, it's better now. Thank you.
Okay, great. My talk might be a little longer than I expected, but Okay, and it messed up a little bit on my thing. So, thanks for inviting me all. I appreciate coming here. So this talk is about how to use inclusive language in open source communities. So let me start off with who am I? And just 1 second here. I wanted to get my timer going. this, okay, so who am I? So for work, I am the principal ecosystems engineer at IT Renew Incorporated. You might wonder what a principal ecosystems engineer does. And I do many things at this job, but primarily I work with open source projects, especially the corporate open source projects. Whether that's Kubernetes or the Open Compute Project or a number of others, and basically I deal with how do we manage contributions to these upstream projects, how do we build engineering processes based on the upstream code, how it works internally. I also work with various leaders, industry leaders there to uh, uh, try to move the projects in a direction that would be great for our company and so forth. IT Renew is something called a circular data center. We actually work on lowering carbon footprint by letting you, instead of buying new servers, you can buy through recertified servers that will help the planet in general, because you're not building new ones, but it requires strategic use of open source. It's probably no surprise to most people. I work for the Gnome Project. I was a former director of the Gnome Project. I've been part of Gnome for about 23 years or so. And in contrast to my work, I work in the community open source or free software. I am very conversant in digital conversations, and I've been doing them for 4 decades since I was a teenager, whether it's bulletin board systems on phones, by calling my through the phone, through a server, or various other things. And during that time, I have built a digital persona, and so forth. So in that lifetime, I've seen a lot of conversations go by, and so that's who I am. So on to my next slide, if it will show up. So what's this talk about? Right, I got a nice picture of various forms of vegetables. I promise you there will not be any more food pics. I hope none of you are getting hungry looking at that. But this idea is of inclusivity, right? And that means being inclusive to many different kinds of people, many different kinds of culture, and many different kinds of attitudes, and so forth. I think you get the point. So, but all of these is important because when you're, what is the greatest asset to an open source project or free software project? And that's the people, right? We do want code. Code is great. Code is amazing, but it's the people that run it. And so if you're out there trying to build an open source project, trying to do something that might maybe improve the world through code, or maybe do solve a problem, people are is what you need to be able to do that. And building a community, inclusivity is one of the most important parts of of doing that, is being able to be include everyone so that you can get the widest spread of contributors helping you with your project, or helping others, or being comfortable in a project you're working in. If you're interested in a project, if it's inclusive, it has many kinds of people, so are you, because you know that your concerns, your various your concerns it will matter, right? So and the point this is, even though we're building and gaining people, it's important that you retain them. And if you're a monoculture, that's going to be hard because the language in a monoculture is not generally inclusive. And if you just got potatoes, you only can make one kind of food, or many kinds of food, but it's just potatoes. It's so. As some of you know, it's been mentioned that I do a initiative called Scalable Onboarding, and while we don't talk about inclusivity as part of that, it's more of a data-driven project. But it's sort of inferred that if you're growing teams, and this is idea is to intelligently grow teams, right? If you're growing teams, it's inferred that you want to retain them for the longest part, and where your contributors come from should be from the widest net possible. So if you have all of these folks coming in, then to retain them, you want to be inclusive. You want to be able to have, uh, especially if they're underrepresented minorities or genders or whatever, because if they're feeling inclusive, they're going to hopefully want to stay on. And as a community project versus a corporate project, the kind of people you get is much wider in terms of the kind of folks, because they're there because it's aspirational. They're there because there's something fantastic about building a desktop, right? And one of the great things about Gnome or KDE or anything in the app ecosystem is the great amount of engineering that we do in the Linux world. Our impact on the Linux platform is so large. It's hard to imagine where it is if we weren't part of it. Uh, just booting up your computer, a lot of our work is in there, but we were doing there because we were able to retain content, and we were in there because we want to retain contributors, right? So it's the aspirational parts of this project is what really gets me excited. It gets me excited to bring people into this project, and it keeps me excited to retain them as well. So inclusivity always starts with language, and how is the how do you start with language, right? And it's always about the conversations you have in um, in a project, right? Whether it's on IRC, if you use IRC, or Slack or some other chat stuff. So there's all kinds of places, because conversations is our main form of communication in open source and free software. And if you have many different kinds of people, you need to know how to start interacting with them so that you don't create needless friction. And so let's kind of talk a little bit about the kinds of conversations. And one way to start is technical discussions. There's a lot of things that over the years when I look at technical discussions, and I think, wow, that is really triggering, because it so is negative. And as a whole, from my observations, engineers tend to be somewhat blunt in their conversations, in their assessment. And engineers tend to be very opinionated people, and that could be possibly because it's male dominated, and a lot of times we don't color our words, and I include myself in this. Certainly, any of these things I say here includes me as well as part of that education, and but we do have very triggering conversations, and so let's let's um, let's start with some examples that um, maybe you've seen yourself, or I certainly I've seen that is very triggering to me. Um, I just want to say one other thing. When we were talking about inclusivity, uh, we're a lot of times if we're it's usually understood in the open source world or even in business, inclusivity is about having conversations that are not like gendered or other kinds of things here. It's that conversation, but it's also somewhat meta as well, because at least in like technical conversations, um, uh, and it's one of those things about technical conversations. Just talk. It's just about the code. It's just about the code, right? It's generally not about just the code, and it always drives me crazy when people say we're just focusing on code. It's and as if somehow our attitudes or stereotypes or any of these things do not come in, or even racism, or it doesn't come in during these technical conversations. So on that point, um, that's not true. It's not about code. So let's go through some of these examples. Why would you want to do that? I don't think that is very useful. You're wasting your time. It's not going to work. Just stating facts. Now, all of these are at least triggering to me. I do not know if they're triggering to you, but I find them not very inclusive. And if we were to go back, and how would we talk about rephrase these conversations? And I would start off with, why would you want that? And I fall into this way because it does not immediately to me mean, why do I care, right? And that's generally the what comes across, right? And it's just saying, why would you want that? Tell me, you could say, that's interesting. Tell me, why is this interesting to you? And maybe you can get an understanding why you would want it. What is interesting about this project that you think all of us would like? And that gives them a chance to make a case, right? Even though it doesn't immediately respond to you. Sometimes you make a instant connection. Other times you don't. I don't think that is very useful, and that's just a negative comment based on your own personal opinion, which honestly you honestly not worth. I have an unsolicited opinion like that, and some of these things are unsolicited opinions that happens in conversations, and there's nothing worse than having unsolicited negative feedback. If nobody's explicitly asking you for an opinion, especially if it's negative, then it's best to keep it to yourself. And so so when people say I don't think that's very useful, that's an opinion that it may not be useful for you, for the work you do, or anything else, but a lot of folks who write these code, right? They're there to scratch their own itch. They're solving a problem that's that its output is useful for them. It may be useful to other. If it doesn't connect with you, that's fine. You don't need to give your opinion. You're wasting your time. It's not going to work. That's not great either. It's their time to waste, and and just because you think it may not be work, maybe they can. Maybe they're looking at it in a way that's different from what it is. Now, how would you respond instead? Would be in my experience, I have seen this before, and I ran into a number of issues. And have you thought about them? Would be a much better conversation because it works towards solutions. Just stating facts is just simply stating facts. It's your fact. Some things are facts. 8 bits is a byte. That's a fact. But sometimes we masquerade personal opinions as facts, and we should be aware of that. But that's let's turn it on the other direction as a person. If you're saying, I don't think that's very interesting to me, that's not a valid use case. Why would I want to do that? I don't think that's very interesting to me. And if you're a mentor or a maintainer or something of that nature, don't. If you don't think that's very interesting to me, that's not quite the right way to um, start a discussion with somebody, especially if you're trying to uh, um, trying to get people to come to your project. If you're talking like that, then there's you're not. That's not. Instead, what would you say if it's not interesting to you? You would say something to something of the matter of, well, you could say something to the point of, tell me why this is interesting. Tell me why. Put it this way: if you're a project and you have a organizing principle, and you want to do that, say, here's the things that are interesting to me and the problems I'm solving in my project. Tell me how this fits in, and that I should add to it. Is one manner of having that conversation. This is why if you have a open source project or a free software project and you have these materials available, that way you're able to redirect these conversations. So thinking that's not very interesting to me, you're able to say, here is this body of work I'm doing, and this is where I'm focusing my time and energy on. You might want me to spend more time. Please help me make the case why I should incorporate that. That's not a valid use case. And this happens a lot with designers, right? This is not a valid use case, but you have to, again, document what you feel is a valid use case, and you have to go back, and if somebody gives you this feedback, well, this is why, at least this pointing out to those things helps you have a more positive conversation, a more erudite conversation about what it is, so that you can set your direction. And again, I'm cloning the first example there. Why would I want to do that? And again, it goes back to what you're really trying to say is, I have a limited amount of time and effort that I would like to spend, that I have to spend on this project. tell me why this is important to you and why I should be able to spend on that project. Because, and ultimately, in the end, they might attack the very principles of what your project is. But this goes back to the previous one. You're wasting your time, or whatever it is. It's your project, and it's important to you, and you have control over how contributions are made on it. So a lot of what this slide is about is trying to explain how to change conversations, because negative conversations are stop energy, right? It weighs down on you. It slows you down. But but conversations are positive, pumps you up. It makes you feel great. It makes you want to keep working on the project. It makes you want to keep working with other people. And all of those things, especially if you're having useful technical conversations, but not bogged down by having irritating technical conversations that tends to be repeating because you're constantly defending yourself on this very project. Now, that said, if you're getting a lot of that, then that might be an indication that you yourself are not communicating properly, and you might want to take a step back and look at what people have done. But that doesn't excuse people's behavior on how they interact with you. And so those are kind of bits on technical conversations. But then there's the non-technical conversations, and non-technical conversations happening, especially in a large project like Gnome that has many different kinds of teams. You have non-technical teams, or I'm sorry, I'm not going to say non-technical here. I should change that. Non-programming, because everybody's technical in this project. So my mistake. I apologize. We should say non-programming conversations, and that means teams that are doing non-programming. I would say, say the engagement team, who have a number of technical contributions, as well as um, people involved in video or various sales, and you're having conversations with developers. There's a lot of those conversations can be rife with possible friction if not aware, right? And I don't have a ton of those examples. There's a lot of them, but I think a lot of folks know about "Hey guys," that's an endangered term. Don't use that. Something like using "That's really retarded" is also very not inclusive, because you're specifically calling out mental health. You are such a nerd, or a dork, or any other kind of nomenclature. I know some of these are very kind of US centric, but I'm certain there are local idioms that may sort of say the same thing in whatever language. And this is an interesting one, because um, in a conversation that is among peers that are well established, your relationships are well established, meaning your audience is known, it could be very much a term of endearment. I have and I will say non-technical friends or non-programming friends, and they would frequently tell me, "Oh, you're such a nerd," because the things that excite me are these computer things that they don't really uh, quite understand, but they're very amused by my enthusiasm. But I know them. We're friends for years, and so forth. So there's less that. But if you're in a public forum or some other things, then those can be problematic, because people are watching and you're setting a standard. And a lot of these conversations get more and more important as you become more well known, or you establish a reputation. Open source is it's not just technical excellence, but it's also a reputation if and trust, and those things happen if you're using inclusivity as part of it. And the more you go up, the more that pressure to be inclusive grows. And if you're a person who's ambitious and want to climb up, then you definitely have to use inclusivity to be able to build those trust relationships. And if you're making comments in a public forum, even to people who are uh, quite familiar or using familiar terms with each other, uh, it's still a perception issue, and we should be careful. And I'm probably going over my time here, but I'll try to speed it up. And so I do want to do a little audience participation. Hopefully nobody's suddenly fearful on that. But I am curious to know, and you can type this on chat, what kind of things trigger you in a conversation, and what gets you upset by words or snippets of words that it says. So does somebody have something they can share? I thought this might go awry because I'm not sure. Sometimes it's hard to, and it's okay if nobody wants to share. Um, but uh, but it is worth understanding that we do have things that trigger us, and certainly the one that I talked about, like why would I want to do that? It is one that triggers me quite a bit, and I'm not immune to that myself. Right. Federico says, what about local jokes that the audience might not understand? And and humor is absolutely, especially with your localized humor, that's hard to understand, can be quite isolating for people. And in fact, that was a good point. I actually wanted to mention that I had forgotten. Jokes is one of the a good way to get yourself into trouble because of how it's interpreted. What we have as humor for one, it can be quite offensive for others, uh, and something that does not translate very well. Uh, uh, Using humor can be quite comfortable, but only to employ it in an audience that you know quite well. So, uh, but again, going back to my one thing about having these triggers, just last week, I saw something on a forum about an extension. The first thing that came to mind was, why would I? What is interesting about this? And of course, I don't say that, and I give this as an example that even I have work to do on even just those thoughts arising. But the interesting bit of that is a person who did come up with that. And I have another initiative. I do a lot of initiatives called Extensions Rebooted, and this very person uh, is actually involved in my initiative, and he's using that knowledge of writing that extension, even the very extension that I thought, what is so useful about that? Is using that he's now a reviewer of our extensions. And so he is now a valued contributor helping to help make extensions better, that experience better by working on the huge queue of extensions that needs to be looked at. And so if I had gone around and said, well, what's that? You can see how it affects how it could have affected even things that would have been good for me, right? So that I thought that was a good example of how you could have you avoided a negative feedback because you said something that wasn't very inclusive. Now, it's almost always you're going to be in a situation where that might actually happen, or if you did tell to a local of a joke, or you did, or you got to a situation where things are getting heated, and in that time it's really important that you have situational awareness. And situational awareness is the idea that you are involved in something and realize that things are turning negative. And by understanding their situational awareness, you can work to act on changing the conversation. And I know that not everyone is, and this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be confrontational uh, at all. And there's many of us who are not very good at confrontational. But understanding a situation means that you have various tools that can help you, and some of those tools might be DMing the person, uh, and telling them, "Hey, listen, I think the other person is getting really upset," or and then maybe it might be worth changing the tone, uh, introducing a conversation that get people out of that negative feedback cycle, or defending the person who's out there, right? So situational awareness is very important, and I've seen people who are not situationally aware allow a conversation that they regret later, and certainly I have felt that way in conversations I've seen um, that drives me crazy. So that's one part of it. And once you're in that stage of understanding there, this is a great point to understand how to do de-escalation. And de-escalation, and I will talk about the code of conduct right on the next slide. So the idea is not everybody can do de-escalation, and but de-escalation is a way, and I've gotten myself into trouble um, before, especially on social media or something. And the first bit is once you realize you've offended people or you found ways, the next act is to de-escalate and to change the conversation. And that means changing how you talk to the person, using more inclusive, and this is not always easy for people. A lot of people have a lot of pride, uh, but it's always great to be empathetic, because our empathy is our greatest asset as human beings, uh, and to be able to empathize with the other person helps you in de-escalating, because you use softer language, you 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 could apologize or acknowledge feelings, and uh, those are great things, because we have, as human beings, we have an amazing capacity for forgiveness. And if if we reach out and say, look, I clearly upset you in the matter, and I apologize for the way I conversed with you. Let's change the conversation. Let's have another kind of conversation so that we can be more respectful. Because in that act, that is shows amazing empathy for the other person, and you create bonds that way. uh, People like that, because it's not easy for us to admit we're wrong, and we are wrong if we have inadvertently hurt people with the words we say, because words are very powerful weapons. But in the end, if none of those work, we have a code of conduct. And that code of conduct is how we can arbitrate fairly between parties who have been aggrieved. And as Federico says, GNOME has a code of conduct committee. And if you see behavior that is not inclusive or violates the code, the published code of conduct that we have, uh, then we should definitely um, uh, make a note to the committee, and they can help de-escalate. They can help arbitrate between parties and make sure that we come to a fair and just uh, uh, fair and just ending. Uh, uh, so going forward, so that's an important tool. These are great tools to help create an inclusive organization. So to wrap it up, and I've used more of my time than I expected. I'm so sorry. I guess it's great that I'm at the last. But on the other hand, I think I really helped put everybody back on schedule. So it's important to know that we're all going to make mistakes. Every human, we make mistakes all the time, but we have tools. We have tools to help improve the situation by using more inclusive language, having situational awareness, and then learning to de-escalate. And ultimately, there's organizational tools like the code of conduct that can help us as well maintain a great project that all of us can help work in, be excited to be working in every day. I've been part of GNOME for so long. It's and there's a reason why I I keep coming back and putting my time every day. It's because the people are amazing. I've had such great friends and conversations, and I could not be where I am today without working on GNOME and building the relationships I have. So those are great things. So if you want to reach out to me and see what mistakes I make, still do. You can reach me out on Twitter on SRAM Krishna. You can mail me at tree@gnome.org. You can talk to me on Rocket Chat at chat.gnome.org, or all my slides are licensed for you to share. And that's the end. And thank you for your time and everything. And I look forward to your questions. So I just wanted to acknowledge all the photos that that I posted on this talk. That I got all of them from Unsplash, which is a great place to get photos that are freely licensed. So there's that. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Sri. That was awesome. That was good. And yeah, so we would do it like this. We like to entertain questions, but we like to entertain those questions with like with the questions that will be asked on the next item of the event because of our time. And then we'll be going straight to the next item, which will be the last item, which is a panel session. This panel section would be is about open source in Africa. That is open source in Africa. We want to talk about the contribution. We want to talk about the present status of Africans in open source, and then we want to talk how we can make it better, and then how we can do it better. And I have four great people who will be my panelists today, and I would like to start from the ladies. Yeah, ladies first. Okay. So I would like to start by introducing someone. She's a Python developer from Nigeria, and then she sparked about involving more beginners into open source, and that's a dream for her. And then I would like to invite the person of Ruth Ikega. Hi, Ruth.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome, Ruth. And
Yeah.
the next person, I would like to invite the person of Peace. Or I like to call her Perry. I don't know. When I see Peace and Perry, I get confused which one she's bearing. Peace is a product designer with great involvement in building amazing products. She has been a lover of open source with active contribution to creating and ensuring woman-centered design and all that. Hi, Peace. Hey, Peace. I can see that your watch. I'll take it after the meeting. Yeah, thank you, Peace. Okay, so the next person I want to call here is our own person in Nigeria is known, and then that's a person of Samson Godi. Samson Godi. I don't know how I can introduce him and give him introduction because I don't think I'll be able to do that. I would just like to introduce Samson. Hi, Samson.
Hey, what's up? How you doing?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I'm good. And the last, but not the least, is who just finished speaking, and that's the person of Sri. Hi, Sri.
Hi there. How you doing?
Yeah, welcome, everybody. So quick one. Will be asking you some couple of questions about open source in Africa because we believe that these are the problems, and then and then we're looking for solutions to it. So the first question would go to Samson Godi. And that question is, what is the perception of Africans about open source? Or what do you think is the perception? What do Africans think about open source?
I would say first, I would try to be more specific. I would say for Nigerians, it's more of like you're doing a free job for no cause, and because one of how the open source definition is. So when I'm saying open source, I'm referring to collaborations. I'm referring to volunteering. I mentioned a lot of volunteering. I'm referring to um, just basically building your skills, and which again, it's not like really bad. But the point is, there's a lot of also some, we're in an ecosystem where you get to hear a lot of come and work for me, and you get the experience in a wrong way. So when somebody's trying to explain what open source is, it's always geared into that conversation by saying, okay, you can come and volunteer for Gnome or Gnome, or depending on how you pronounce it. But also, it's a thing that you really need to go to go into like an extra mile to explain to people by showing more of like success story. So what I usually do when I try to explain open source is try to connect my personal lifestyle or my personal growth with open source by saying, okay, I did this, and I was able to do that, and I was able to achieve this, and this is what you do in order to get to this point, but not try to oversell myself. So I don't give them too much of a high hope because again, the success, into technology is not based on what you do; it's about the way you personalize some certain things and then make some personal decisions. So yeah, so in general, the open source definition is not properly defined in a way that an African can just look at it and jump on it. There always needs to be some kind of a personalization when it comes to defining open source.
That actually makes sense. I think that's true for Indians as well. That there's it becomes it's not immediately obvious, like at least like in India, and then once before any other, but a lot of times in my own family would say like, where does this lead to a job? And there's this practical sense of where does this go? Where do these contributions lead? Do they lead to somewhere? Does it go somewhere? And it's only your own personal conviction, and this is where Samson says, "This is the things I did. This is the thing." It's only those personal conviction that gets you in that stage where you want to contribute, and because there's a sense of personal growth that comes from that's not necessarily leads to a job, but the personal growth will lead you to a job, I guess, to that extent. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Samson and Sri. So going to the next question, I would like to ask the ladies in the house. Ruth, what are the problems that you feel that women are facing in Africa when it comes to open source? When it comes to open source.
Okay, so I'll first start off with problems I face personally. So with women, we already know that there's this gap in technology space globally, and even down to Africa, there's still the gap, and there's still also the gap with women in open source. Yeah. So initially, how I even got involved in open source was through the WOSCA initiative by Oscar, Open Source Africa, and She Code Africa. So there was like a joint initiative to bring more women into contributing to open source. So there was this challenge in July. So that challenge actually spurred like more women. I think a good number of ladies were able to contribute to open source. So I would say first, the issues that relate with women contributing is first that there's still that bias of the gap in tech. So most of them are not aware that they can actually like contribute to open source. Then the few people that want to contribute, there are some challenges they face. Most of the time they don't know how to, they always think it's about code. Like I know I've talked to some certain people, and they are actually really surprised when I say open source contribution, you can contribute your ideas. Some of them are actually surprised. And most of the time, I think I was talking to a friend that was 2 days back, and I was telling the person, most of the people that ask me about what open source is and how to get involved are mainly male, the guys that ask me how do I get involved in open source. And whenever like someone, like I think out of 100%, it's like 5% of ladies that I've actually like beginners that actually like talked to about contributing to open source. So they're always feeling it's about all about code. And I think for ladies, most of the ladies are into design, which I know Perry will talk about more of design in open source in Africa. But so since more ladies are into design, they also feel left out in that design space. They feel they cannot contribute because they are designers, still boiling down to that. They always feel like it's about code, and then technical ability. So for beginners, for people that are beginning, they always feel, okay, I don't have enough skill set to start to contribute. Meanwhile, like for me personally, I started contributing from I think 3 months into tech, and if I would want to rate my progress or what I've contributed so far, I'd say it's actually meaningful. So there's the fact that beginners do not want to contribute to open source because of the technical, they feel they don't have like the technical skills. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruth. And yeah, to the next question. Yes, peace. I know you're a product designer, and I know you're good at what you do, and you are a lady. So, how well do you think ladies can contribute? Because I know a lot of ladies want to go into design and all that. How well do you think ladies can contribute in the aspect of designing to open source in Africa? Peace, you low. We can't hear you. Oh, yes, still low. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
All right, good now, good. Thank you.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Oh yeah. So I think the whole idea of design in open source is not really very particular to Africa or to ladies in Africa. I think it's more like a very generic thing, because even a lot of international designers also get really surprised when you talk about open source design. They're like, it's very strange to them, because a lot of people, like Ruth said, have the whole idea of open source, oh, that's for people who write code, that's for developers, it has nothing to do with us designers. And I feel like this kind of like comes from the design culture. Designers do not grow out as being very open. We have very, very close design systems. Most times you find developers being able to share codes and just do things related to codes openly, but you find that very, very strange when it comes to the design world. People are always like to themselves and to their team. So there's this whole idea of open design is really strange to the whole community at large. And I think in Africa, for us to get more females into designing open source, first they have to get really comfortable in actually designing themselves. I know we have this gender gap down here, like Ruth mentioned, about having females thinking that this is a guy's world. We don't actually belong here. So I think once we are able to actually educate them and let them know that, oh, there's this stereotype is not there. It's not like, it's not a gender thing, right? So when, if you're actually interested in coming into tech, yeah, it's for everyone. You can come into tech, and once you start designing, you literally don't have to wait for you to be very good at what you do before you start contributing to open source. Like Ruth mentioned, she said contributing to open source 3 months into her journey into tech. I started contributing to open source the month I started learning about tech. So it's literally like making them understand that you don't have to get to a certain level of comfortability with what you do for you to actually come into the space of open source. And I think we need to actually still talk about the fact that there are projects who actually need design contributions, and we need to kind of like, I think one way we can bridge that gap is kind of like making them aware of those projects that actually need design contributions, because it's very easy, or it's easier for developers to actually find open source projects to contribute to than for designers to find open source projects to contribute to. So I think it's from both making them aware and then making organizations who actually have projects that can be design related more open to those who actually want to contribute design wise.
Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Perry. Thank you very much. And I would like to go to Sri. And then this question is, it's kind of, how would I put it? I'm trying to be inclusive here too, like you just, like you just said. Okay, so majority of Africans, so many times, they complain about this, racism, people trying to let you feel like you're black, and you don't know what I know, or you are not actually, I don't know how I can place it. I'm trying to be careful with my words, but how is Gnome treating this particular matter, so that it's good that we know as Africans, that yeah, we have an organization, or there is an organization that is looking into this part.
Sure. I think the single most tool that we have is a code of conduct. That is the arbiter of issues that we see within the project, especially for Nigerians and Africans who are coming into the project. It's our greatest thing, and we've worked really quite hard on the code of conduct. Actually, uh, Federico is who's I think still on the channel is part of the code of conduct committee, and we've worked with many external people who do code of conduct as their specialty, and we work with them quite closely to come up with a fair code of conduct that will protect everyone in the project, regardless of creed, race, or religion.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a quick answer. And lastly, I want to throw an open question, and then I want you all to answer in 10 seconds, and that will bring us to the end of the the panel session. So, how do you think people in Africans can actually undo their jobs, like my job, and then open source altogether? Because that's a big problem. Like someone like me, I'm a full-time developer, and sometimes you don't even have the time to say you want to look into open source. So how do you advise Africans to go about this? 10 seconds starting from 3.
Could you repeat the question one more time? I didn't.
All right. How well do you advise people to undo their jobs, their local jobs, with open source contributions? That is just the question.
Okay, so how do you like improve your jobs by using open source
Yeah.
contributions?
No,
Okay.
not improve. Like, how do you manage both? You have your
How
job
do you
and then
manage,
you have
okay, how do you
open
manage
source.
your okay? So so today my job is all open source, right? I get paid to do most of this work as open source but when I first started off, I did manage both my work and my open source contributions, and I it depends on your employer to some extent. A lot of so today, at least in the US, a lot of tech companies will give you a certain amount of personal time or work time to work on open source projects, because especially if that company is consuming open source. So they realize that it's sort of a bit of a PR, public relations, in the sense that if you're contributing, it shows that the company is contributing to open source, and that makes them look good in these communities that they're consuming. So that's one bit. If it's not a company that's using open source, I usually set certain amount of time with doing your open source after hours or whatever it is. But it's also very important from a legal perspective that that your open source life and your corporate life are separate, meaning they're on separate computers and things like that, so that there is no cross pollination, I guess, so to speak, between studios. I think that's a very important part of that, so that a company doesn't, decide to use the work you've done as work and then take advantage of it. That's one aspect of that. But in general, you if you can find a way, use the two of them as interspersed, because I usually use open source as free training, so to speak. A lot of companies care about training, and open source is education. It's training, because by going through the motions, if you're a developer, you're able to understand the human aspects of learning how to convince somebody to accept your technical contribution, or if you're a designer, the same way, or any other kind of thing. So that's my
Okay, thank you very much. Quickly, I would like Samson to give his own contribution on that. How do Africans manage their job? Africans company, right? Our tech company, that majority of them, they will not even give you, if they hear open source, they will ask from you, why was this one? You're writing another person's code. I mean, you are doing another person's design. So you're in Africa, and then that is why I want you to answer, how do you advise Africans to manage open source and their local jobs? Quickly, in a minute, please.
Okay, this
Hello.
is a tough one. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so it's a tough one. That's one of the reasons I don't work for any Nigerian company, to be honest. Then two, if you see yourself working for a Nigerian company, I would say I feel like if you leave your contributions to your employers, it's going to be really hard, to be honest, because one, I have been opportune to talk to, some CEOs, including some companies that most developers definitely want to jump on, and they almost don't see the value. Speaking from 2018, I feel like 2020 is different, but they almost don't see the value of what open source is. Like particularly, so I would say it depends on your scope of work, right? If you're somebody that the company respects, they would always want to invest more time in you and also give you the opportunity to explore options and follow your passion. But then if you're this traditional, when I mean traditional, I'm referring to people local. If you're this traditional person that you're in it for the money and the company just see you as somebody that, obviously in it, like you're based, your point of just working is just to get the money and you're not showing any kind of value, they would want to use that against you in some level. But generally speaking, I would say it's not easy. But I've seen some persons contribute to open source, even despite where they're working from. Usually, it's always around the weekends. So I would say they try to do things during off work, because again, some people work 9 to 5, and they do that maybe probably in the evenings or during the breaks. Because again, in open source, depending on what you're doing, it doesn't necessarily have to be a code contribution, right? There's a lot of things you could do. There's design, there's a bunch of things you could do. But then I would say, personally, I can't personalize this question because I would definitely don't want to work for any company that would not encourage me to contribute to open source. In fact, I see that company as more of like a flag red, But for people that necessarily don't have any choice, I would say try to do a lot of time management. Try as much as you can not to take too many tasks, and also try as much as you can to always talk to your company or your boss or your manager, to encourage your manager to see the value of what open source is. So for example, like there's 90% chances that your company uses a tool that obviously is open source, and by encouraging the company to say, hey, we use React on our project, and there's a React open source project, don't you think working for or contributing to this React project internally would help the company? And this is one of the reasons why corporate companies in the US or in Europe, like Google, Apple, does have like the open source program office as a way to encourage employees to contribute to open source. So I would say it could be an amazing opportunity for you to convince your company to invest more in open source by having some kind of a OSPO, that's open source program office related, or something related to that, or they could even pay you to even contribute to a project. So I would say try as much as you can to be like a self-advocate on that, but also place more time on time management.
Okay, thank you very much, Samson, on that. Ruth, the same question goes to you. What's your advice? I don't know if you're working for a German company too.
So my advice would be, it's still something about multitasking, yeah. So I think one thing someone can do is to schedule your time to contribute to open source. And since you're on a job, I think you should focus more on, let's say, doing just one and make it quality. So if you have a job by the side, just focusing on maybe contributing to one organization actually helps, instead of contributing to two and just being all around, or three and just being all around and not being able to effectively contribute. So I think you should just, as a work person or as a 9 to 5 person, you should do like one open source organization and actively contribute. Schedule your time, maybe like something said, during the weekends or any time that is your free time, like part of your free time that is aside resting. So I think that's one good way.
Oh, thank you very much, Ruth. And Perry, what do you have to say on that?
With the African ecosystem that I know and the organizations who are here in Africa, I know that little or none of the organizations actually show support to open source, and it's actually going to be quite difficult for you to work for them and still be able to convince them or make them see reasons why you need to contribute to open source. But the same time, you can actually try to do that. Like Samson says, you have to be that person that the organization values, right? Not just like the kind of work you're putting in or the fact that you're there for the money. They have to value you as an individual for them to give you that extra hand to actually like contribute to open source. But if you're not able to convince the organization as to why you need to contribute to open source at that time, then it all boils down to how much you're able to manage your time and how much you're able to fix your priorities. And yeah, you can always, it's time for work is basically mostly 8 hours, 6-5. So you can literally just set out a particular time that you contribute to an open source project. And I feel like if you're not doing something code related, maybe you're working on documentations during your free time, maybe on break or something, you could just look through a documentation and make your contributions. It doesn't have to be just be in a very serious environment, but it all boils down to what organization you are with and what you're actually working on. And I don't work for any Nigerian company, like Samson said, so I can't really tell how difficult it is for people to contribute to open source working with local organizations. But I know that most of our local organizations here do not appreciate open source itself. So it's quite difficult for you to convince them to actually work on open source projects. So it all boils down to how well you're able to manage your time and how well you're able to manage your activities to fit that open source project into your schedule and try to like balance up everything, which is going to be difficult. But I think if it's something you do regularly, you would eventually get used to it and maybe find an open source organization that could actually like you could apply for and work for. It's always easier to work with organizations that actually appreciate open source and appreciate the work you actually do in the open source space.
Oh, okay, that's great. That's great. Thank you very much, Perry. Thank you, Ruth, thank you, Tree, and Sam. I personally would have loved to ask you guys questions, more and more, but because of our time, we won't be able to take any more questions. And if you want to ask these people more questions, please Samson, Ruth, Perry, try and drop your social media contact or your email and so on, like for someone to be able to contact you. So that will bring us to the end of the panel section, and I really appreciate you for the short notice and all that. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. So that brings us to the end of the panel session.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so moving to the end of everything, there's this saying that say better is the end of a matter than the beginning thereof. Sorry for that. All right, so I would like to for us to give a quick vote of thanks, and then I would like to do that on behalf of Dome Africa and on behalf of Miss Regina, who is the person fronting this. Mrs. Regina, sorry, that Miss Regina looks fast. I'm sorry about that. On behalf of everybody in the Gnome African and team, I would like to say thank you very much for taking your time to attend this event. And then I would like us to know that we are at the we are at the work of research country limelight Africa. Some people to everybody to people who are not even in the organization. So thank you very much for coming around. Thank you to all our speakers, and then we appreciate you. Until the next time that we'll be meeting, because for sure we're having events, we're having short events and call out sessions and all that. Until then, I am Ayo Ulua Oloshinde, and then I want to say goodbye to everybody. Thank you very much.